Hello everyone, I am the Macabre. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you from and what time are you watching now? Sit back and relax. The storm rolled in with a fury that none of them had expected. Dark clouds swallowed the sky, and the wind howled through the trees like a warning. The group of friends had been laughing and joking just hours earlier, but now the atmosphere was tense as their car crawled up the muddy road toward the cabin. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He had promised them a weekend of relaxation, but the storm and the eerie forest were already making them regret the trip. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her arms crossed as she stared out the window. She had always been the skeptical one, and this trip was no exception. "Are you sure this is the right way?" she asked, her voice tinged with irritation. Ethan nodded, though he wasn't entirely confident. The cabin belonged to his family, but he hadn't been here in years. The last time he'd visited, his older brother Mark had been with him. That was before Mark disappeared. In the back seat, Chris and Jessica were trying to lighten the mood with jokes, but their laughter felt forced. Ryan, ever the practical one, was checking his phone for a signal. "Nothing," he muttered, stuffing it back into his pocket. The forest around them seemed to close in, the trees leaning ominously over the narrow road. The rain began to fall in heavy sheets, pounding against the car like a drumbeat. Ethan pressed the accelerator, desperate to reach the cabin before the storm got worse. When they finally arrived, the cabin looked more like a relic from a forgotten time than a vacation spot. Its wooden walls were weathered and gray, and the roof sagged in places. The windows were dark, and the porch creaked under their weight as they stepped onto it. Ethan fumbled with the key, his hands trembling from the cold and unease. "Home sweet home," Chris joked, but no one laughed. The door swung open with a groan, and the smell of damp wood and dust hit them like a wall. Inside, the cabin was just as they remembered it from Ethan's photos, but it felt different somehow. The furniture was covered in sheets, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew. Jessica shivered as she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room for signs of life. "It's cozy," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. Ethan moved to the fireplace and began stacking logs, hoping to chase away the chill. "We'll be fine once we get a fire going," he said, more to himself than to the others. The storm outside grew louder, the wind rattling the windows and the rain drumming on the roof. Sarah found herself glancing over her shoulder, her unease growing with each passing minute. "Did you hear that?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Everyone froze, listening. For a moment, there was only the sound of the storm. Then, faintly, they heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all around them. Chris laughed nervously. "Probably just the wind," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. Ethan lit the fire, and the warm glow of the flames helped to ease some of the tension. The group gathered around the fireplace, their voices low as they tried to distract themselves from the storm and the strange noises outside. Jessica pulled out a deck of cards, and they began to play a game, though their hearts weren't in it. The cabin felt like a cage, its walls pressing in on them as the storm raged on. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. As the night wore on, the noises outside became more frequent: twigs snapping, leaves rustling, and that same low growl that sent chills down their spines. Sarah moved closer to Ethan, her fear finally breaking through her skepticism. "Maybe we should check the doors and windows," she suggested. Ryan nodded, grabbing a flashlight and heading to the front door. He tested the lock, making sure it was secure. The others followed his lead, checking every window and door in the cabin. When they reached the basement door, Ethan hesitated. The door was old and warped, with a heavy padlock securing it. "What's down there?" Jessica asked, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan shook his head. "I don't know. It's been locked for as long as I can remember." Chris joked about treasure or bodies, but no one laughed. The basement door felt like a boundary they weren't meant to cross, and they all felt it. The storm reached its peak around midnight, the thunder shaking the cabin to its foundation. The group huddled around the fire, their nerves frayed and their exhaustion setting in. Sarah was the first to suggest going to bed, and the others quickly agreed. They divided the rooms, with Ethan and Sarah taking the master bedroom and the others splitting up the remaining space. As they settled in, the noises outside seemed to fade, replaced by an eerie silence. But the silence didn't last. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, a deafening crash woke them all. The sound of breaking glass and splintering would echoed through the cabin. Ethan was on his feet in an instant, grabbing a flashlight and rushing toward the noise. The others followed, their hearts pounding. They found the living room in shambles, the windows were shattered, and the front door was hanging off its hinges. And there, in the darkness outside, they saw it, a massive, shadowy figure with glowing eyes, watching them from the edge of the forest. The creature let out a bone-chilling howl, and the group scrambled back, their fear paralyzing them. Chris grabbed a poker from the fireplace, his hands shaking. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, though no one had an answer. The creature lunged at the cabin, its claws tearing through the wood like paper. Ethan shouted for everyone to get to the basement, and they didn't need to be told twice. They ran as the creature continued to attack, its growls and snarls filling the air. The basement was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of earth and mildew. Ethan slammed the door shut behind them, fumbling with the lock. The others huddled together, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. Above them, they could hear the creature tearing through the cabin, its rage unmatched. Jessica began to cry, and Sarah tried to comfort her, though she was just as terrified. Ethan clenched his fists, trying to think of a way out. But deep down, he knew they were trapped. As the sounds of destruction continued above them, Ethan's mind raced. He thought of his brother Mark, who had disappeared in these woods 5 years ago. He thought of the stories his grandfather had told him about the curse that had plagued their family for generations. And as the creature's roars filled the night, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary animal. This was something far more dangerous, and it wasn't going to let them leave the cabin alive. The basement was a claustrophobic nightmare, its low ceiling and damp walls pressing in on them like a tomb. The group huddled together in the dim light of a single flashlight, their breaths shallow and uneven. Above them, the creature's relentless assault continued, its claws scraping against the wood, its guttural growls reverberating through the floorboards. Jessica clutched Sarah's arm, her face pale and tear-streaked. "What is that thing?" she whispered, her voice trembling. No one answered. None of them had an explanation that made sense. Ethan's mind raced as he scanned the basement for anything that could help them. The room was cluttered with old furniture, rusted tools, and boxes stacked haphazardly in the corners. His eyes landed on an axe propped against the wall, its blade dull but still sharp enough to be useful. He grabbed it, the weight of it giving him a small sense of control. Chris noticed and shook his head. "You're not seriously thinking of going out there, are you?" Ethan didn't respond. He wasn't sure what he was thinking. The creature's growls suddenly stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was almost worse. The group froze, their eyes darting to the ceiling as they waited for the next sound. It came moments later, a faint scratching, like claws dragging across the floor directly above them. Jessica let out a stifled sob, and Ryan quickly covered her mouth with his hand. "Quiet," he hissed, his voice barely audible. The scratching moved closer, the sound of it sending shivers down their spines. Ethan tightened his grip on the axe and moved toward the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. "Stay here," he whispered to the others, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to protect them or just buy himself time. He crept up the stairs, each step creaking under his weight. When he reached the top, he pressed his ear against the door, listening for any sign of the creature. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a low, guttural growl erupted from the other side, so close that Ethan stumbled back. From the basement, the others watched in horror as the door began to rattle in its frame. The creature was trying to get in. Jessica let out a choked scream, and Chris grabbed her, pulling her away from the stairs. Ryan picked up a rusted pipe from the floor, his hands shaking as he held it like a weapon. The door rattled harder, the lock straining under the pressure. Ethan braced himself at the top of the stairs, the axe raised and ready. He knew it wouldn't be enough. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the rattling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan stood frozen at the top of the stairs, his knuckles white from gripping the axe. He waited, his breath held, but the creature didn't return. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly descended the stairs, his legs trembling with every step. "It's gone," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. The others exchanged uneasy glances, their fear still palpable. For the rest of the night, no one slept. They sat in a tight circle in the basement, the flashlight between them casting long shadows on the walls. The storm outside continued to rage, the rain pounding against the cabin like a relentless reminder of their isolation. Jessica finally broke the silence, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We need to get out of here," she said, her eyes darting to the stairs. Ethan nodded, but he knew it wasn't that simple. The creature was still out there, and the forest was its domain. As the first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the basement door, the group cautiously made their way upstairs. The cabin was in shambles, windows shattered, furniture overturned, and claw marks gouged into the walls. Sarah picked her way through the debris, her face pale. "What kind of animal could do this?" she asked, though no one had an answer. Ethan knelt by the front door, examining the scratches. They were too precise, too deliberate to be the work of a wild animal. Chris stepped outside, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of the creature. The rain had stopped, leaving the forest damp and quiet. Too quiet. "We need to leave now," he said, his voice urgent. Ethan nodded, but they all knew the car was their only way out, and the road would be a muddy mess. Ryan grabbed the keys from the counter and headed for the door. "Let's go before that thing comes back," he said, though his voice lacked confidence. The group moved quickly, gathering what little supplies they could carry. Ethan hesitated, his eyes falling on the basement door. He couldn't shake the feeling that something important was down there, something that might explain what was happening. But there was no time to investigate. They needed to leave. As they stepped outside, the forest seemed to watch them, the trees swaying slightly in the breeze. The car was where they'd left it, but the tires were slashed, and the hood was dented as if something heavy had landed on it. Jessica let out a cry of frustration, her fear turning to anger. "Now what?" she demanded, her voice rising. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "We'll have to walk," he said, though the thought of venturing into the forest filled him with dread. The group began their trek through the woods, the mud clinging to their shoes and slowing their progress. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. As they walked, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. Nothing moved, but the sensation persisted. Sarah grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Ethan, look," she whispered, pointing to the ground. There, in the mud, were footprints human at first glance, but with elongated claws at the tips. The group stared at them in silence, their fear growing with every passing second. The footprints led them deeper into the forest, toward a clearing where the trees thinned out. In the center of the clearing was a makeshift altar, its surface stained with something dark and dried. Surrounding it were bones, some animal, some human. Jessica let out a strangled gasp, and Chris turned away, his face pale. Ethan stepped closer, his heart pounding. On the altar was a familiar object, a necklace that had belonged to his brother Mark. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Before he could process what it meant, a low growl broke the silence. The group turned as one, their eyes landing on the creature as it emerged from the trees. It was larger up close, its fur matted with mud and blood. Its glowing eyes locked onto them, and its lips curled back to reveal sharp, dripping fangs. Ethan raised the axe, his hands trembling. "Run," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The creature lunged, and the group scattered, their screams echoing through the forest. The forest was alive with the sounds of chaos, footsteps pounding against the muddy ground, branches snapping as the group scrambled in every direction. The creature's guttural growls echoed through the trees, a relentless reminder that it was close. Ethan ran, his lungs burning as he clutched the axe tightly in his hands. He could hear Jessica's panicked screams somewhere to his left, but he didn't dare stop. The creature was faster, stronger, and it was hunting them. Sarah was at his side, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she struggled to keep up. "Ethan, we can't outrun it," she cried, her voice desperate. He didn't respond, his mind focused on finding a way to lose the creature or, at the very least, distract it. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees closing in around them like a maze. Every shadow felt like a threat, every sound a warning. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the area for any sign of safety. Behind them, Ryan and Chris were trying to keep Jessica steady, but her panic was making it difficult. She stumbled over roots and rocks, her hands clawing at the air as if she could push the creature away. "It's coming!" she screamed, her voice cracking. Ryan glanced over his shoulder, his eyes widening as he saw the creature barreling toward them. He grabbed Jessica's arm and yanked her behind a tree, pressing her against the trunk to keep her quiet. Chris followed, his face pale with fear. The creature slowed, its massive form moving with an eerie grace as it sniffed the air. Its glowing eyes scanned the area, searching for its prey. Ethan and Sarah ducked behind a fallen log, their bodies pressed together as they tried to stay silent. Ethan could feel Sarah trembling against him, her fear radiating like a tangible force. He tightened his grip on the axe, his mind racing for a plan. If they could distract the creature, maybe the others could get away. From their hiding spot, Ryan watched the creature with growing dread. He knew they couldn't stay there forever. The creature's sharp senses would find them sooner or later. He glanced at Chris, who was gripping a rusted pipe like a lifeline. "We need to make a run for it," Ryan whispered, his voice barely audible. Chris nodded, though his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the weapon. Jessica shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I can't," she sobbed. "I can't do it." Ethan saw his chance. He picked up a rock from the ground and hurled it as far as he could, the sound of it hitting a distant tree echoing through the forest. The creature's head snapped toward the noise, and it let out a low growl before lunging in that direction. Ethan held his breath, praying the distraction would buy them enough time. He gestured to Ryan, Chris, and Jessica to move, and they didn't hesitate. They bolted, their footsteps barely audible on the soft ground. Sarah grabbed Ethan's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan clenched his jaw, his mind made up. "I'll lead it away." "You go with them," he said, his voice firm. Sarah shook her head, her grip tightening. "No, Ethan, I'm not leaving you." Her voice was desperate, but Ethan couldn't afford to argue. He gently pried her hand off his arm and gave her a push toward the others. "Go, Sarah. Now." The creature returned, its eyes locking onto Ethan as if it could sense his plan. It let out a deafening howl, the sound vibrating through the forest like a warning. Ethan stood his ground, the axe raised and ready. The creature lunged, its claws slashing through the air. Ethan swung the axe with all his strength, the blade connecting with the creature's shoulder. It let out a roar of pain and stumbled back, but the wound was shallow. It wasn't enough to stop it. Ethan knew he couldn't win this fight. He turned and ran, the creature hot on his heels. His legs burned as he pushed himself to go faster, weaving through the trees in a desperate attempt to lose it. He could hear the creature's growls growing closer, its breath hot on the back of his neck. His heart pounded in his chest as he searched for a way out, but the forest seemed to have no end. The trees blurred together, their twisted branches reaching out like hands trying to grab him. As he ran, Ethan stumbled upon a clearing. In the center was a large, gnarled tree with roots that twisted out of the ground like serpents. The tree's trunk was marked with strange symbols, carved deep into the wood. Ethan hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to stay away, but he had no choice. The creature was right behind him, its growls turning into a deafening roar. He dodged behind the tree, hoping it would provide some kind of protection. The creature stopped at the edge of the clearing, its eyes narrowing as it stared at the tree. It seemed reluctant to enter, its growls turning into low, wary snarls. Ethan leaned against the tree, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. He glanced at the symbols on the trunk, his mind racing. Could this be some kind of protection against the creature? Or was it something far more dangerous? The standoff didn't last long. The creature let out a blood-curdling howl and charged, its claws extended and ready to strike. Ethan braced himself, the axe raised high. As the creature lunged, he swung with all his strength, the blade sinking deep into its side. The creature roared in pain, its blood splattering on the ground as it stumbled back. It was wounded, but not defeated. Its glowing eyes locked onto Ethan, filled with a rage that sent chills down his spine. Ethan knew he couldn't keep fighting. His arms were trembling, and his body ached from the exertion. He glanced at the tree behind him, the strange symbols catching his eye once more. There was something about them, something ancient and powerful. He didn't understand what they meant, but he knew they were his only hope. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the carvings just as the creature lunged again. A blinding light erupted from the tree, the symbols glowing with an otherworldly intensity. The creature let out an ear-piercing scream as it was thrown back, its body hitting the ground with a deafening thud. Ethan shielded his eyes, the light so intense it felt like it was burning through him. When the light faded, the creature was gone, the clearing silent once more. Ethan collapsed to his knees, his body trembling from the adrenaline and exhaustion. He didn't know how long he sat there, his mind reeling from what had just happened. The tree's symbols were dark again, the power they had unleashed fading like a dying ember. Ethan could hear the others calling his name, their voices distant but growing closer. He wanted to call back, to let them know he was alive, but his voice caught in his throat. All he could think about was the creature, its glowing eyes, its blood-soaked claws, and the unrelenting rage that had driven it. As his friends finally reached the clearing, Ethan realized the truth. This wasn't over. The creature was still out there, and it wouldn't stop until it had hunted them all down. The tree had bought them time, but it wasn't a solution. They needed to find a way to end this, or none of them would make it out of the forest alive. The group gathered around Ethan in the clearing, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear. Jessica was still shaking, her hands clutching Sarah's arm like a lifeline. Chris kept glancing over his shoulder, as if the creature might reappear at any moment. Ryan was the first to speak, his voice tight with tension. "What the hell just happened?" he demanded, his eyes fixed on the tree with the strange symbols. Ethan shook his head, his mind still reeling from the encounter. He touched the carved symbols, his fingers tracing their jagged edges. They felt warm, as if the power that had erupted from them still lingered. Ethan couldn't explain it, but he knew the tree had saved his life. "It's some kind of protection," he said finally, his voice low. "The creature wouldn't come near it." Sarah stepped closer, her eyes scanning the symbols. "What do they mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan shrugged, his unease growing. "I don't know, but we need to figure it out." The group stayed in the clearing for a while, their nerves too frayed to venture back into the forest. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ground. The tree's presence offered a small sense of safety, but they all knew it was temporary. The creature was still out there, and it wouldn't stop until it had hunted them all down. Chris paced back and forth, his frustration boiling over. "We can't just sit here and wait for that thing to find us again," he said, his voice rising. "We need to do something." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. He knew they couldn't stay in the forest forever, but they also couldn't risk running blindly into the creature's path. "We'll head back to the cabin," he said finally. "We'll be safer there." The others hesitated, their fear of the cabin's memory of the attack still fresh. Jessica shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "But what if it's waiting for us?" she asked, her eyes wide with terror. Ethan clenched his jaw, his resolve hardening. "We don't have a choice." With the tree's protection fading, the group reluctantly began their journey back to the cabin. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves under their feet. Every shadow seemed to move, every tree felt like a threat. Ethan led the way, his axe gripped tightly in his hands. Sarah stayed close to him, her own fear etched across her face. Chris and Ryan walked behind them, their weapons ready. Jessica trailed at the back, her steps slow and hesitant. When they finally reached the cabin, it looked even worse than they remembered. The windows were shattered, the walls torn apart by the creature's claws. The door hung limply on its hinges, barely holding on. Ethan stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of the creature. The others followed, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The cabin felt colder now, its walls pressing in on them like a tomb. As they settled in, Ethan found himself drawn to the basement door. The heavy padlock was still in place, but the scratches around the edges were fresh. Ethan hesitated, his hand hovering over the lock. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was down there held the answers they needed. Sarah noticed his hesitation and placed a hand on his arm. "Ethan, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. Ethan took a deep breath, his mind made up. "We need to know what's down there." The others gathered around as Ethan fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking slightly. When it finally clicked open, the door creaked as it swung inward, revealing a dark staircase. The air that wafted up was damp and musty, carrying the scent of earth and decay. Ethan grabbed the flashlight and led the way, the others following cautiously behind. The stairs groaned under their weight, the sound echoing through the basement like a warning. At the bottom, the basement was as cluttered as they remembered. Boxes and old furniture were stacked haphazardly, their surfaces covered in dust. But what caught Ethan's attention was the corner of the room, where the light from the flashlight revealed a large, circular symbol drawn on the floor. It was surrounded by candles, their wax melted and dried long ago. The symbol itself was intricate, filled with strange markings that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan stepped closer, his flashlight illuminating the symbol. It was similar to the one on the tree, but more detailed, more deliberate. Chris let out a low whistle, his fear momentarily overshadowed by curiosity. "Looks like some kind of ritual," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Ryan knelt beside the symbol, his fingers brushing against the markings. "This isn't just a protection spell," he said slowly. "This is something else." Ethan's mind raced as he examined the symbol. He thought of his brother Mark, who had disappeared in these woods. He thought of the stories his grandfather had told him about the family curse. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but the picture they formed was terrifying. "This is how the curse works," he said finally, his voice low. "This is why my brother disappeared. He tried to break it." The others stared at him, their faces pale with realization. Jessica stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the symbol. "But what does that mean for us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan took a deep breath, his mind racing. "It means we're part of this now," he said, his voice grim. "The creature won't stop until it's finished what it started." The weight of his words hung in the air, suffocating them. The basement felt colder now, the symbol on the floor seeming to pulse with a life of its own. As they stood there, a low growl echoed through the basement, the sound coming from somewhere above. The group froze, their fear paralyzing them. The creature was back, and it was closer than ever. Ethan grabbed the axe, his hands tightening around the handle. "We need to finish this," he said, his voice firm. "We need to break the curse." The others nodded, though their fear was palpable. They didn't have a choice. The creature was hunting them, and the only way to survive was to face it head-on. The growling above grew louder, shaking the walls of the cabin as the creature prowled around, searching for them. The group stood frozen in the basement, their eyes locked on the staircase that led to the upper floor. Ethan gripped the axe tightly, his knuckles white. "We need to do something fast," he said, his voice low and urgent. Sarah nodded, her eyes darting to the symbol on the floor. "We need to complete the ritual," she said, her voice trembling but determined. Ethan stepped closer to the symbol, his flashlight illuminating its intricate details. The markings were unlike anything he had ever seen, a mix of ancient runes and twisted, almost organic shapes. He knelt down, his fingers brushing against the lines etched into the floor. "How do we even start this?" he asked, his frustration growing. The others gathered around, their faces pale and their fear palpable. Chris shook his head, his voice tight with panic. "This is crazy. We don't even know what we're doing." Ryan, ever the practical one, began examining the surrounding area. He found an old, dusty journal tucked beneath a stack of boxes, its pages yellowed with age. He flipped through it quickly, his eyes scanning the faded handwriting. "Look at this," he said, his voice tinged with urgency. The others crowded around him, their fear momentarily overshadowed by curiosity. The journal was filled with notes and diagrams, most of them centered around the symbol on the floor. Ethan grabbed the journal, his eyes darting across the pages. The handwriting was his grandfather's, and the notes detailed a ritual meant to banish the creature once and for all. His heart raced as he read, his mind struggling to process the information. "This is it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is how we end it." The others exchanged uneasy glances, their fear growing with every word. The ritual required more than just knowledge, it required sacrifice. Sarah stepped closer, her eyes scanning the journal over Ethan's shoulder. "What does it say?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan hesitated, his stomach twisting with dread. "It says we need to recreate the symbol with blood," he said, his voice heavy. "And we need to light the candles at midnight." Jessica let out a choked sob, her fear overwhelming her. "Whose blood?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Ethan looked at her, his face grim. "It doesn't say." The group fell silent, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. The creature's growling above had turned into a low, guttural snarl, and they could hear the sound of its claws scraping against the floorboards. They didn't have time to think, to argue, to second-guess. Ethan clenched his jaw, his mind made up. "I'll do it," he said, his voice firm. Sarah grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with panic. "Ethan, no!" she cried, her voice breaking. But he shook his head, his resolve unwavering. "We don't have a choice." Ethan knelt in the center of the symbol, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled out a small pocket knife. The others watched in stunned silence, their fear and disbelief written on their faces. He pressed the blade against his palm, wincing as he made a shallow cut. Blood welled up, dark and thick, and he let it drip onto the symbol. The markings seemed to absorb it, the lines glowing faintly as the blood spread. The air in the basement grew colder, the atmosphere charged with an otherworldly energy. Sarah knelt beside him, her face pale but determined. She grabbed the knife and made a cut on her own palm, adding her blood to the symbol. The others hesitated for a moment before following suit, each of them contributing to the ritual. The symbol grew brighter with every drop, the glow intensifying until it was almost blinding. The creature's snarls above turned into a deafening roar, the sound shaking the walls of the basement. It knew what they were doing, and it wasn't going to let them finish. Ryan grabbed the journal, his eyes scanning the pages. "It says we need to light the candles," he said, his voice urgent. The others moved quickly, each of them grabbing a candle and lighting it with trembling hands. The flames flickered in the cold air, their light adding to the glow of the symbol. The creature's claws began tearing through the floor above, the sound of splintering wood filling the basement. The group huddled together in the center of the symbol, their fear and determination driving them forward. Ethan looked at the others, his face grim. "We need to say the words," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Ryan flipped through the journal, finding the incantation written in his grandfather's shaky handwriting. He began to read, his voice trembling but determined. The words were ancient, their meaning lost to time, but they carried a power that was undeniable. The creature's roars grew louder, the sound of it breaking through the floor almost deafening. As Ryan finished the incantation, the symbol erupted with a blinding light, the glow so intense it felt like it was burning through them. The creature let out an ear-piercing scream, its body thrown back by the force of the ritual. The light spread through the basement, filling every corner and chasing away the shadows. The group shielded their eyes, the intensity of the light overwhelming them. The air grew still, the sound of the creature's roars fading into silence. When the light finally faded, the basement was silent. The creature was gone, its presence erased as if it had never existed. The symbol on the floor was dark, the glow completely extinguished. The group stood there, their bodies trembling and their minds reeling from what had just happened. Ethan slumped to the floor, his exhaustion catching up with him. The others followed suit, their fear and relief mingling into a strange, numbing calm. Ethan looked at the others, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is it over?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The others nodded, their faces pale but relieved. The curse was broken, the creature banished, and they were alive. But the cost had been high, and the weight of what they had done would stay with them forever. The basement was silent now, the only sound the faint flickering of the candles. The forest outside was quiet, the storm finally over. As they sat there, the reality of what they had faced began to sink in. The cabin, the forest, the creature, it was all over. But the memories would haunt them, the scars both physical and emotional reminding them of the night they had faced the mark of the beast. Ethan closed his eyes, his mind drifting to his brother Mark, who had disappeared in these woods. He hoped, wherever Mark was, that he could finally rest. The group sat in silence, the weight of their shared ordeal binding them together. The dawn came slowly, its light filtering through the broken windows of the cabin. The storm had passed, leaving the forest damp and quiet. The group emerged from the basement, their steps slow and heavy. They didn't speak, their silence a testament to what they had endured. The creature was gone, but its mark would remain, a reminder of the darkness they had faced and the strength it had taken to overcome it. The morning sun cast a pale light over the cabin, its broken windows and splintered walls a grim reminder of the night's horrors. The storm had passed, leaving the forest damp and eerily silent. The group stood outside, their faces pale and their bodies heavy with exhaustion. No one spoke, the weight of what they had endured too great for words. Ethan leaned against the porch railing, his hands trembling as he stared into the forest. The creature was gone, but the memories of its growls and claws were etched into his mind. Sarah was the first to break the silence, her voice soft but steady. "We need to get out of here," she said, her eyes scanning the tree line as if expecting the creature to reappear at any moment. The others nodded, their relief tempered by the knowledge that they were still deep in the woods, far from safety. The car was useless, its tires slashed and its hood dented. They would have to walk, and the thought of venturing back into the forest filled them all with dread. Chris shoved his hands into his pockets, his face pale and drawn. "What if it's not really gone?" he asked, his voice tight with unease. The others exchanged uneasy glances, the question lingering in the air. The ritual had worked at least. It seemed to have worked, but the lingering fear made it hard to believe they were truly safe. Ethan pushed himself away from the railing, his jaw clenched. "We can't stay here," he said firmly. "We'll figure it out as we go." The group gathered what little supplies they could carry from the cabin, their movements slow and deliberate. The basement, with its symbol and journal, felt like a distant nightmare, its presence still haunting them. Ryan tucked the journal into his backpack, its weight a constant reminder of what they had done. Jessica stayed close to Sarah, her hands trembling as she clutched a water bottle. Her fear was palpable, her eyes darting to the shadows under the trees as if they might come alive at any moment. Ethan took the lead, his axe slung over his shoulder. He didn't feel like a leader, but someone had to guide them out of the forest. The path ahead was unclear, the muddy ground and dense trees making it hard to navigate. The group followed in silence, their footsteps muffled by the damp leaves. The forest seemed different now, its usual sounds absent, as if it too was recovering from the night's chaos. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made them freeze, their fear still fresh. As they walked, Sarah fell into step beside Ethan, her voice low. "Do you think it's over for good?" she asked, her eyes scanning the trees. Ethan hesitated, his grip tightening on the axe. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we did what we had to do." Sarah nodded, though her expression remained uncertain. The ritual had worked, that much was clear, but the idea of the beast returning was hard to shake. It felt like a shadow hanging over them, a constant reminder of what they had faced. The hours passed slowly, the forest stretching on endlessly. The group's exhaustion grew with every step, their bodies aching from the night's ordeal. Jessica stumbled often, her legs weak and her fear making it hard to focus. Chris and Ryan took turns helping her, their own fear masked by determination. Ethan kept moving, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. He didn't know where they were going, but he knew they couldn't stop. The forest felt alive, its trees watching them, their branches twisted like claws. By midday, the group reached a small stream, its water clear and cold. They stopped to rest, their bodies collapsing onto the damp ground. Ethan knelt by the stream, cupping the water in his hands and splashing it on his face. The cold was a relief, washing away some of the exhaustion. The others followed suit, their silence broken only by the sound of the water. For a moment, it felt like they could almost forget what had happened, almost pretend they were just hikers resting on a long trail. But the illusion didn't last long. As Ryan sat down to refill his water bottle, he noticed something on the ground, a set of tracks, similar to the ones they had seen before but smaller, almost human. His heart raced as he called the others over, his voice tense. "Guys, look at this," he said, pointing to the tracks. The group gathered around, their fear returning in full force. Ethan knelt to examine the tracks, his stomach twisting. The creature was gone, but the forest still felt dangerous, alive with secrets they didn't understand. Sarah's voice broke the silence, her tone urgent. "We need to keep moving," she said, her eyes darting to the trees. The others nodded, their exhaustion overshadowed by fear. They had no choice but to press on, no matter how tired they were. The forest seemed to close in around them, its shadows growing darker as the afternoon sun began to wane. Ethan took the lead again, his axe ready, though he hoped they wouldn't need it. The tracks were a reminder that the forest wasn't done with them yet. By late afternoon, the group finally reached the edge of the forest, the sight of the open road bringing a wave of relief. The trees thinned out, the muddy ground giving way to gravel. For the first time in hours, they felt like they could breathe. Jessica sank to her knees, her hands shaking as she let out a choked sob. The others stood in silence, their relief tempered by the knowledge that they weren't truly free. The memories of the cabin, the creature, and the ritual would stay with them forever. As they walked toward the road, Ethan glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the forest one last time. The trees stood tall and silent, their shadows stretching out like silent witnesses. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the forest wasn't done with them yet. But for now, they were safe, and that was enough. The group reached the road, their steps slow and deliberate. The first car they saw pulled over, the driver's face filled with concern as he took in their disheveled appearance. The ride back to town was silent, the group too exhausted to speak. The driver tried to make conversation, but his words fell on deaf ears. Ethan stared out the window, his mind replaying the events of the past day. The creature was gone, its curse broken, but the scars it had left, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal. The others sat in silence, their faces pale and their eyes haunted. They had survived, but the cost had been high, and the weight of what they had endured would stay with them forever. When they finally reached town, the driver dropped them off at the nearest diner, his concern evident as he offered to call for help. The group declined, their silence speaking volumes. They sat in a booth, their exhaustion and fear binding them together. The waitress brought them coffee, her eyes filled with pity as she took in their disheveled state. No one spoke, the silence heavy with unspoken fears and questions. The creature was gone, but its mark would remain, a reminder of the darkness they had faced and the strength it had taken to overcome it. By evening, the group had made their way to a nearby motel, their bodies collapsing onto the beds as soon as they walked in. The room was small and dimly lit, but it felt like a sanctuary after the horrors of the forest. Ethan lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. The others were already asleep, their exhaustion finally catching up with them. But sleep didn't come easily for Ethan. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the creature's glowing eyes, heard its guttural growls, felt its claws scraping against the floorboards. As the night deepened, Ethan finally drifted off to sleep, his body surrendering to exhaustion. But his dreams were haunted by the forest, its twisted trees and shadowy corners alive with the echoes of the creature's growls. The mark of the beast was gone, but its memory would stay with them forever, a reminder of the darkness they had faced and the strength it had taken to survive. The group slept fitfully, their dreams filled with the echoes of the forest, the weight of their shared ordeal binding them together in ways they didn't yet understand. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of the motel room, casting a pale light over the group as they stirred awake. Ethan sat up slowly, his body still heavy with exhaustion and his mind foggy from the night's restless sleep. The others were waking up too, their movements slow and deliberate. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of the past few days pressing down on them. The motel felt like a surreal bubble, a brief respite from the horrors they had faced, but it couldn't last forever. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice soft but filled with a quiet determination. "We need to tell someone what happened," she said, her eyes scanning the room. The others hesitated, the idea of explaining the creature, the ritual, and the forest's darkness feeling impossible. Chris shook his head, his voice tense. "Who's going to believe us?" he asked, his frustration evident. "We sound insane." Ryan nodded in agreement, though his expression was thoughtful. "We need to think this through," he said, his voice calm but firm. Ethan rubbed his face, his mind racing. He knew they couldn't just pretend nothing had happened, but the idea of recounting the story to anyone, let alone the police, felt overwhelming. "We'll figure it out," he said finally, his voice steady. "But we need to be careful. We don't want to draw the wrong kind of attention." The others nodded, though their unease was palpable. The forest, the cabin, and the creature were secrets they carried, and the weight of those secrets was heavy. After a quick breakfast at the diner next door, the group decided to return to the forest, though the idea filled them all with dread. They needed to see the cabin one last time, to make sure the creature was truly gone and to gather any evidence that might help them explain what had happened. The thought of stepping back into the woods was terrifying, but they knew they couldn't leave it unfinished. The rental car they borrowed was quiet, the drive filled with tension as the trees loomed closer on the horizon. When they reached the edge of the forest, the group hesitated, their fear palpable. The trees stood tall and silent, their shadows stretching out like dark fingers. Ethan took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the axe he had insisted on bringing. "Let's get this over with," he said, his voice firm. The others followed, their steps slow and deliberate. The forest was quiet, the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves absent. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath, watching them. The walk to the cabin was tense, every snap of a twig making them freeze. The mud from the storm had dried, leaving the ground hard and cracked. The forest seemed different now, its usual life gone, as if the creature's presence had drained it of its energy. The cabin came into view, its broken walls and shattered windows a grim reminder of the night's horrors. The group stopped at the edge of the clearing, their fear growing as they took in the sight. Ethan stepped forward, his axe raised and ready, though he hoped he wouldn't need it. The others followed, their footsteps muffled by the dry leaves. The basement door was still open, the symbol on the floor dark and lifeless. The group gathered around it, their unease growing as they remembered the ritual. Ryan knelt to examine the symbol, his fingers brushing against the markings. "It's like it's dead," he said, his voice low. "The power's gone." Ethan nodded, though his mind was racing. The creature's growls, its claws, its glowing eyes, it was gone, but the memory was still alive. As they searched the cabin for anything that might help them explain what had happened, Jessica found something, a small, leather-bound book tucked beneath a broken floorboard. She called the others over, her hands trembling as she held it up. The book was old, its pages yellowed and brittle, and the writing inside was in a language none of them recognized. Ethan took the book, his mind racing. It felt important, like it held answers they hadn't found yet. The group left the cabin as the sun began to set, their steps quick and purposeful. The forest felt even more oppressive in the fading light, its shadows growing darker and longer. They didn't speak until they were back at the car, their relief palpable. The drive back to town was quiet, the weight of what they had done and what they had found pressing down on them. The book felt like a key, but to what, they didn't yet know. By the time they reached the motel, the sun had set, the night sky filled with stars. The group gathered in their room, the book placed in the center of the table. Ethan flipped through the pages, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the writing. The language was unfamiliar, but the symbols were similar to the ones in the basement and on the tree. "This is part of it," he said finally, his voice low. "This is part of the curse." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes scanning the pages. "We need to find someone who can translate this," she said, her voice filled with determination. The others nodded, though their unease was growing. The book felt like a Pandora's box, its pages filled with secrets they weren't ready to face. But they knew they didn't have a choice. The creature was gone, but the curse and the forest was still alive, its darkness reaching out to them even now. The group spent the rest of the evening researching, their phones and laptops lighting up the dim motel room. They found a professor at a nearby university who specialized in ancient languages and rituals, and they made plans to visit him the next day. The idea of sharing their story with a stranger was terrifying, but they knew it was their only hope. The book felt like the final piece of the puzzle, its secrets the key to understanding what had happened to them. As the night deepened, the group finally gave in to exhaustion, their bodies collapsing onto the motel beds. But sleep didn't come easily, their dreams filled with the forest's twisted trees and the creature's glowing eyes. The past few days had changed them, binding them together in ways they didn't yet understand. The creature was gone, but its mark in the forest's darkness would stay with them forever, a reminder of what they had faced and the strength it had taken to survive. The next morning, the group piled into the rental car and set off toward the university, the leather-bound book resting on the dashboard like a silent passenger. The drive was quiet, each of them lost in their thoughts. Ethan kept glancing at the book, his mind racing with possibilities. He didn't know what they would find, but he knew it had to be important. The forest's secrets were buried in those pages, and they needed to uncover them before it was too late. The professor, Dr. Alan Greaves, had agreed to meet them on short notice, his curiosity piqued by their vague description of the book. When they arrived at the university, the campus was bustling with students, their laughter and chatter a stark contrast to the group's heavy silence. Dr. Greaves' office was in the history department, a small, cluttered room filled with books and artifacts. He greeted them warmly, his sharp eyes immediately landing on the book in Ethan's hands. "This is it?" he asked, his voice tinged with excitement. Ethan nodded, handing it over carefully. "We think it's connected to something supernatural," he said, his voice hesitant. Dr. Greaves flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing as he studied the symbols and text. The group watched in silence, their anxiety growing with every passing second. The professor's face grew more serious as he read, his excitement giving way to concern. "This is Old Norse," he said finally, his voice low. "But it's mixed with something else, something much older. Where did you find this?" Ethan hesitated, glancing at the others. "In a cabin in the woods," he said carefully, not mentioning the creature or the ritual. The professor's expression darkened, his fingers tracing the intricate symbols on one of the pages. "This isn't just a historical artifact," he said, his voice grave. "This is a grimoire, a book of dark magic. These symbols, they're part of a summoning ritual. Where exactly is this cabin?" The group exchanged uneasy glances, their fear growing. Ryan stepped forward, his voice steady. "It's in the Blackwood Forest," he said. "We think it's connected to a curse." Dr. Greaves' face paled at the mention of the forest, his hands trembling slightly as he closed the book. "Blackwood Forest," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "You need to stay away from there. The stories about that place, they're not just stories." Ethan leaned forward, his voice urgent. "What do you know?" he asked, his heart racing. The professor hesitated, his eyes scanning the group as if weighing how much to tell them. Finally, Dr. Greaves spoke, his voice low and heavy with unease. "Blackwood Forest has been the site of rituals and disappearances for centuries. The locals call it the Marked Woods because of the symbols carved into the trees. They're protection wards, meant to keep something in or out. The creature you mentioned, it's likely tied to an ancient curse. If you've already encountered it, you're in more danger than you realize." The group fell silent, their fear growing with every word. The professor's knowledge confirmed their worst fears. The curse was real, and it wasn't over. Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly. "Is there a way to break it?" she asked, her eyes filled with desperation. Dr. Greaves hesitated, his fingers drumming on the desk. "The grimoire might hold the answers," he said finally. "But translating it will take time and it's dangerous. If the curse is tied to this book, whoever reads it could become a target." The group exchanged uneasy glances, their fear growing. Ryan spoke up, his voice firm. "We don't have a choice," he said. "We're already targets. We need to know how to end this." The professor nodded reluctantly, his expression grim. "I'll do what I can to translate it," he said. "But you need to be careful. The curse isn't just tied to the forest, it's tied to you now. It will follow you, no matter where you go." Ethan's stomach twisted at the words, his mind racing. The idea that the curse wasn't confined to the forest was terrifying. He thought of the tracks they had seen, the way the creature had hunted them relentlessly. If it could follow them, nowhere was safe. As they left the professor's office, the group felt the weight of his words pressing down on them. The book was a key, but it was also a danger. They needed to know its secrets, but uncovering them could make things worse. The campus felt surreal, the normalcy of the students' lives a stark contrast to their own reality. Ethan gripped the book tightly, his mind racing. They had survived the forest, But the curse was still alive, its darkness reaching out to them even now. That evening, the group returned to the motel, their exhaustion and fear mingling into a strange numbness. They spread the book out on the table, its pages open like a silent invitation. The symbols seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, their meaning still hidden. Ethan stared at them, his mind racing. The professor's warning echoed in his head. The curse was tied to them now. They couldn't escape it, no matter how far they ran. The only way to survive was to face it head-on, but doing so could cost them everything. As the night deepened, the group sat in silence, their thoughts swirling with fear and determination. The book felt like the final piece of the puzzle, its secrets the key to understanding the curse. But unlocking those secrets could unleash something worse. The creature's growls, its claws, its glowing eyes, they were gone, but the memory was still alive, haunting them. The curse wasn't over, and the forest's darkness was still reaching out, its grip tightening with every passing moment. The next morning, Dr. Greaves called, his voice tense. "I've started translating the book," he said. "But you need to come back to the university. There's something you need to see." The group exchanged uneasy glances, their fear growing. They didn't know what the professor had found, but they knew it couldn't be good. The drive to the university was quiet, their minds racing with possibilities. When they arrived, the professor was waiting, his face pale and his hands trembling. He led them to his office, the book open on his desk. "This isn't just a curse," he said, his voice grave. "It's a warning." The group gathered around the desk, their eyes scanning the translated text. The words were ancient, their meaning chilling. The curse wasn't just tied to the forest, it was tied to their bloodline. Ethan's stomach twisted as he read, his mind racing. The creature, the rituals, the forest, they were all connected to a family curse that had been passed down for generations. The book was a warning, a guide to breaking the curse, but doing so would require a sacrifice none of them were ready to make. As the weight of the book's secrets sank in, the group fell silent, their fear and determination mingling into a strange resolve. The curse was alive, its darkness reaching out to them even now. But they had survived the forest, and they would survive this. The book was the key, its secrets their only hope. The creature was gone, but the curse and the forest's darkness would stay with them forever, a reminder of what they had faced and the strength it had taken to survive. The university office felt suffocating, the weight of Dr. Greaves' words pressing down on the group like a physical force. The translated pages of the grimoire lay on the desk, their words a chilling revelation. The curse wasn't just tied to the forest, it was tied to them, specifically Ethan's bloodline. The idea that their family was entwined with such darkness was almost too much to process. Ethan stared at the pages, his mind reeling. The creature, the rituals, the symbols, they all made sense now, but the truth was more horrifying than he had imagined. Dr. Greaves broke the silence, his voice heavy with concern. "According to the grimoire, the curse was placed on your ancestors centuries ago," he explained. "It was meant to punish them for betraying a powerful entity, a being that was summoned but never bound. The rituals in the basement, the symbols, the creature, they're all part of its trap. The curse is designed to hunt your bloodline until it's broken." Ethan's stomach twisted, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the desk. "How do we break it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The professor hesitated, his eyes scanning the group. "The grimoire mentions a final ritual," he said carefully. "But it requires a sacrifice. Not just blood, a life. The curse can only be broken if someone in your bloodline willingly gives their life to banish the entity." The room fell silent, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. Sarah stepped forward, her voice breaking. "There has to be another way," she said, her eyes filled with desperation. Dr. Greaves shook his head, his expression grim. "The grimoire is clear. There's no alternative." Ethan sank into a chair, his mind racing. The idea of sacrificing someone himself, or someone he loved, was unthinkable. But the curse wasn't going to stop. The creature had been relentless, its darkness reaching out to them even now. He thought of his brother Mark, who had disappeared in the forest. Was this what had happened to him? Had he tried to face the curse alone? The questions swirled in his mind, their answers just out of reach. The others watched him, their fear and grief mingling into a heavy silence. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "We'll find another way," he said, his eyes scanning the group. "We've already defied the curse once. We can do it again." The others nodded, though their fear was evident. Dr. Greaves sighed, his expression troubled. "I'll keep translating the grimoire," he said. "But you need to be prepared. The curse isn't going to let you go easily." The group thanked him and left the office, their steps heavy with the weight of what they had learned. As they walked back to the car, the campus felt surreal, its normalcy a stark contrast to their own reality. The grimoire was tucked safely in Ethan's bag, its secrets a constant reminder of the danger they were in. The idea of a bloodline curse was almost too much to process, but they couldn't afford to ignore it. The creature, the forest, the symbols, they were all connected, and the curse was still alive. The group reached the car in silence, their minds racing with fear and determination. The drive back to the motel was tense, the air thick with unspoken fears. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing. The grimoire's secrets were their only hope, but they were also a danger. The curse wasn't just tied to the forest, it was tied to them, and it wasn't going to let them go. The idea of a final ritual, of a sacrifice, haunted him. He couldn't let anyone else die because of this curse. He had to find another way, no matter the cost. When they reached the motel, the group gathered in their room, the grimoire placed on the table like a silent judge. Ethan flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the symbols and translated text. The final ritual was detailed in the last few pages, its instructions chillingly precise. The group watched in silence, their fear growing with every word. The ritual required more than just a sacrifice, it required preparation, specific items, and a precise time and place. It felt like an impossible task, but they didn't have a choice. Sarah broke the silence, her voice trembling slightly. "We can't do this," she said, her eyes filled with fear. "We'll find another way. There has to be another way." Ethan nodded, though his mind was racing. The curse wasn't going to stop, but the idea of willingly sacrificing someone was unbearable. He thought of his family, of his brother Mark, of the others who had disappeared in the forest. The curse had already taken so much. He couldn't let it take anything or anyone else. The next morning, Dr. Greaves called with an update. "I've translated more of the grimoire," he said, his voice tense. "There's a mention of an artifact, a talisman, that could weaken the curse. But it's hidden in the forest, in a place the grimoire calls the Heart of Blackwood." The group exchanged uneasy glances, their fear growing. Going back into the forest was terrifying, but it might be their only chance. Ethan leaned forward, his voice firm. "We'll find it," he said, his determination overriding his fear. As they prepared to return to the forest, the group felt a strange sense of resolve. The curse was still alive, its darkness reaching out to them, but they weren't going to let it win. The grimoire was their guide, its secrets a path to survival. They didn't know what they would find in the heart of Blackwood, but they knew they had to try. The creature, the rituals, the symbols, they were all part of the curse, but so were they. They had survived the forest once, and they would survive it again. The drive to the forest was quiet, the weight of their mission pressing down on them. The trees loomed in the distance, their shadows stretching out like dark fingers. Ethan gripped the axe tightly, his mind racing. The others followed, their steps slow and deliberate. The forest felt alive, its silence heavy with unspoken fears. The heart of Blackwood was somewhere deep in the woods, a place the grimoire described as both beautiful and terrifying. The group didn't know what to expect, but they knew they had to find it. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, the shadows darker. The heart of Blackwood was close, they could feel it. The grimoire's instructions led them to a clearing, its center marked by a massive, twisted tree. The tree's branches stretched out like claws, its bark covered in the same symbols they had seen in the cabin. Ethan approached cautiously, his heart racing. The talisman was hidden here, buried beneath the tree's roots. The group began digging, their fear and determination mingling into a strange resolve. When they finally uncovered the talisman, it was smaller than they expected, a simple pendant made of a dark, almost metallic stone. But as Ethan held it in his hand, he felt a strange energy pulsing through it. The grimoire's words echoed in his mind, "The talisman weakens the curse, but it does not break it." The group exchanged uneasy glances, their fear growing. The talisman was a step forward, but it wasn't the end. The curse was still alive, its darkness reaching out to them even now. As they left the clearing, the forest seemed to watch them, its shadows growing darker and deeper. The talisman was a weapon, but it wasn't enough. The curse wasn't going to let them go, and they knew they would have to face it again. The creature, the rituals, the forest, they were all part of the curse, but so were they. They had survived the forest once, but the real battle was just beginning. The curse was still alive, and the darkness was closing in. The group left the clearing with the talisman, their steps heavy with exhaustion but their resolve unwavering. The pendant felt strange in Ethan's hand, its cold weight pulsing faintly with an energy they couldn't quite understand. The grimoire's warning echoed in their minds. The talisman weakened the curse, but it didn't break it. They still needed to perform the final ritual, but the idea of a sacrifice haunted them. The forest seemed to close in around them, its shadows darker and its silence heavier than before. The heart of Blackwood had marked them, and the curse was still alive. As they walked, the air grew colder, the forest's oppressive energy pressing down on them like a suffocating blanket. The grimoire's instructions had led them this far, but the final steps were still unclear. The talisman was a weapon, but it wasn't enough. The curse was tied to their bloodline, and the entity that had been summoned centuries ago was still hunting them. Ethan gripped the pendant tightly, his mind racing. They needed to find a way to break the curse without someone having to die, but the grimoire's warnings were clear. There was no other way. Sarah broke the silence, her voice trembling slightly. "We can't let anyone die because of this," she said, her eyes filled with determination. The others nodded, though their fear was evident. The idea of a sacrifice was unbearable, but the curse wasn't going to stop. The creature they had faced in the cabin was just one manifestation of the entity's power, and it was still out there, watching them, waiting for its chance to strike. The group walked in silence, their steps deliberate but slow, the weight of their mission pressing down on them. By late afternoon, they reached a part of the forest they hadn't seen before, a dark, twisted grove where the trees seemed to lean toward them, their branches like claws reaching out. The grimoire mentioned this place, calling it the threshold of the entity. It was here that the final ritual would need to be performed, but the idea of stepping into the grove filled them all with dread. Ethan hesitated at the edge, his hand tightening around the talisman. The air here was colder, the shadows deeper, and the silence heavier than anywhere else in the forest. Ryan stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with unease. "This is it," he said, his eyes scanning the grove. "The final step." The group exchanged uneasy glances, their fear growing. The grimoire's instructions were clear. The ritual had to be performed here, at the heart of the curse. But the idea of summoning the entity again was terrifying. They had barely survived the last encounter, and this time they would have to face it fully. Ethan took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. "We don't have a choice," he said, his voice firm. "We end this now." The group stepped into the grove, their steps slow and deliberate. The air felt heavy, the shadows closing in around them. The grimoire's instructions were precise. They needed to draw the same symbol from the cabin's basement in the center of the grove. Ethan knelt to the ground, his hand trembling as he began to trace the symbol in the dirt. The others watched in silence, their fear growing with every passing moment. The symbol felt alive, its lines pulsing faintly with a dark energy that seemed to seep into the ground. As Ethan finished the symbol, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. The talisman in his hand pulsed more strongly, its energy clashing with the darkness of the grove. The group stood in silence, their eyes scanning the trees as if expecting the entity to appear at any moment. The grimoire's warnings echoed in their minds. The ritual would summon the entity, and it would demand a sacrifice. The idea of facing it again filled them all with terror, but they knew they didn't have a choice. The curse was still alive, and it wasn't going to let them go. Suddenly, the air shifted, the grove growing deathly silent. The symbol on the ground pulsed faintly, its lines glowing with a dark light. The shadows around them seemed to come alive, twisting and contorting into shapes that made the group's blood run cold. The entity was here, its presence filling the grove like a suffocating fog. Ethan gripped the talisman tightly, his heart racing. The others stood close together, their fear growing with every passing moment. The entity's voice echoed in the grove, deep and guttural, its words unintelligible but filled with malice. The symbol on the ground pulsed more strongly, its lines glowing brighter. The entity's presence grew heavier, the shadows forming into a massive, grotesque shape that loomed over the group. Its eyes glowed with a dark light, its teeth bared in a twisted grin. The talisman in Ethan's hand pulsed more strongly, its energy clashing with the entity's darkness. The grimoire's instructions were clear: the sacrifice had to be made now, or the entity would claim them all. But the idea of someone dying was unbearable, and Ethan's mind raced for another way. Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling but filled with resolve. "Take me," she said, her eyes filled with determination. The others protested, their voices filled with desperation, but Sarah shook her head. "This has to end," she said firmly. "I'll do it." Ethan's heart twisted, his mind racing. The idea of sacrificing Sarah was unthinkable, but the entity's darkness was growing stronger, its presence suffocating. The talisman pulsed more strongly, its energy clashing with the entity's power, but it wasn't enough. The grimoire's warnings echoed in his mind. The curse demanded a sacrifice. As the entity's presence grew heavier, its voice echoed in the grove, deep and guttural, its words unintelligible but filled with malice. The symbol on the ground pulsed more strongly, its lines glowing brighter. The shadows twisted and contorted, forming into grotesque shapes that made the group's blood run cold. The entity was here, its power growing stronger with every passing moment. The talisman in Ethan's hand pulsed more strongly, its energy clashing with the darkness, but it wasn't enough. The curse demanded a sacrifice, and the entity wasn't going to let them go. Ethan stepped forward, his voice trembling but filled with resolve. "No," he said firmly. "If anyone dies, it'll be me. This curse is tied to my bloodline. I'll end it." The others protested, their voices filled with desperation, but Ethan shook his head. "This has to end," he said firmly. "I'll do it." The entity's presence grew heavier, its voice echoing in the grove, deep and guttural, its words unintelligible but filled with malice. The symbol on the ground pulsed more strongly, its lines glowing brighter. The shadows twisted and contorted, forming into grotesque shapes that made the group's blood run cold. As Ethan stepped into the center of the symbol, the talisman in his hand pulsed more strongly, its energy clashing with the entity's power. The entity's voice echoed in the grove, deep and guttural, its words unintelligible but filled with malice. The symbol on the ground pulsed more strongly, its lines glowing brighter. The shadows twisted and contorted, forming into grotesque shapes that made the group's blood run cold. The entity was here, its power growing stronger with every passing moment. The talisman pulsed more strongly, its energy clashing with the darkness, but it wasn't enough. Ethan closed his eyes, his mind racing. The curse demanded a sacrifice, and he was willing to give it. The talisman pulsed more strongly, its energy clashing with the entity's power. The entity's voice echoed in the grove, deep and guttural, its words unintelligible but filled with malice. The symbol on the ground pulsed more strongly, its lines glowing brighter. The shadows twisted and contorted, forming into grotesque shapes that made the group's blood run cold. The entity was here, its power growing stronger with every passing moment. The talisman pulsed more strongly, its energy clashing with the darkness, but it wasn't enough. As the entity's presence grew heavier, its voice echoed in the grove, deep and guttural, its words unintelligible but filled with malice. The symbol on the ground pulsed more strongly, its lines glowing brighter. The shadows twisted and contorted, forming into grotesque shapes that made the group's blood run cold. The entity was here, its power growing stronger with every passing moment. The talisman pulsed more strongly, its energy clashing with the darkness, but it wasn't enough. The curse demanded a sacrifice, and Ethan was willing to give it. As the entity's presence grew heavier, its voice echoed in the grove, deep and guttural, its words unintelligible but filled with malice. The symbol on the ground pulsed more strongly, its lines glowing brighter. The shadows twisted and contorted, forming into grotesque shapes that made the group's blood run cold. The entity was here, its power growing stronger with every passing moment. The talisman pulsed more strongly, its energy clashing with the darkness, but it wasn't enough. The curse demanded a sacrifice, and Ethan was ready to make it. The envelope arrived on a damp October afternoon, its edges frayed and yellowed with age. Emily Parker hesitated before picking it up, her fingers brushing against the thick, textured paper. The postmark was smudged, barely legible, but she could make out the faint outline of a town she had never heard of, Ash Hollow. The return address simply read, the Orpheum Hall. She turned the envelope over, her heart skipping a beat as she noticed the wax seal, embossed with a grotesque mask of comedy and tragedy. Inside was a single ornate invitation written in calligraphy so precise it looked as though it had been penned by a machine rather than a human hand. The words were formal yet cryptic. You are cordially invited to an exclusive performance at the Orpheum Hall. Doors open at midnight. Attendance is mandatory. Beneath the text was a golden ticket, shimmering faintly in the dim light of her apartment. Emily frowned, trying to remember if she had entered any contests or signed up for any events. Nothing came to mind. Across town, Thomas Grayson found a similar envelope waiting for him on his doorstep. He had just returned from a long shift at the hospital, his mind still buzzing with the day's chaos. The envelope seemed out of place against the modern decor of his apartment building, its antique appearance almost mocking. He opened it cautiously, his eyes narrowing as he read the invitation. The language was formal, yet there was something unsettling about it, as though the words themselves were watching him. Sarah Collins, a journalist with a penchant for urban legends, received hers in the mail. She had been researching abandoned theaters for a new article, and the timing felt too coincidental to ignore. The invitation mentioned the Orpheum Hall, a name she vaguely recognized from old newspaper clippings. The theater had been closed for decades after a tragic fire, and the stories surrounding it were anything but kind. She couldn't shake the feeling that this invitation was connected to her research. Michael Hayes, a recluse who rarely left his house, found his envelope slipped under his door. He hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks, let alone given out his address. The invitation felt like an intrusion, yet he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. The golden ticket seemed to pulse in his hand, as though it were alive. He felt a strange compulsion to attend, despite his better judgment. For each of them, the invitation stirred something deep inside: curiosity, dread, or an inexplicable pull toward the unknown. They didn't know each other, and yet they were bound together by the same eerie summons. The Orpheum Hall, a name that seemed to whisper from the shadows, called to them. None of them could explain why they decided to go, but the thought of ignoring the invitation felt impossible. The night of the performance, the air was thick with an unseasonable chill. Emily drove through winding country roads, the trees looming like skeletal sentinels on either side. Her GPS had stopped working miles back, and she relied on the hand-drawn map included with the invitation. The roads grew narrower, the darkness swallowing her car until the headlights were the only source of light. She felt a growing sense of unease, but it was too late to turn back. Thomas arrived first, his car tires crunching over gravel as he pulled up to the theater. The Orpheum Hall was a massive, crumbling structure that seemed to defy time. Its Gothic architecture was both beautiful and menacing, with towering spires and cracked stained glass windows. The marquee above the entrance was lit with flickering bulbs, spelling out the words, "Tonight's show, the eternal performance." He stepped out of the car, his breath visible in the cold air, and stared up at the imposing building. Sarah pulled up beside him, her curiosity outweighing her fear. She grabbed her camera and notebook, determined to document every detail. The Orpheum Hall had been a graveyard of rumors for decades, and she couldn't pass up the chance to see it for herself. Michael arrived moments later, his face pale and drawn. He didn't speak, merely nodded at the others before turning his gaze toward the theater's towering doors. Emily joined them, her hands trembling as she clutched the invitation. The four strangers exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. They were united by the same unspoken question. Why had they been chosen? The doors of the theater creaked open on their own, revealing a dark, cavernous interior. A faint smell of mildew and decay wafted out, mingling with the crisp night air. Inside, the theater was both breathtaking and horrifying. The walls were adorned with peeling murals depicting scenes of chaos and despair. The chandelier above dripped with dusty crystals, casting eerie shadows across the rows of velvet seats. The stage was shrouded in darkness, silent and waiting. A man in a suit stood at the edge of the stage, his face obscured by a grotesque mask. He gestured toward the seats with a slow, deliberate motion. The group hesitated, but the man's presence was oddly commanding. They took their seats, the velvet cold and damp beneath them. The man disappeared behind the curtains, leaving them alone in the deafening silence. The air grew heavier, as though the theater itself were alive and watching. They could feel the weight of the building's history pressing down on them, a history steeped in tragedy and death. The lights dimmed suddenly, plunging the theater into complete darkness. A single spotlight illuminated the stage, revealing the masked man once more. He bowed deeply, his movements unnaturally smooth. "Welcome," he said, his voice echoing as though it came from all directions at once. "Tonight's performance is unlike any you have ever seen. You are not merely spectators, you are participants. The show cannot begin without you." The words sent a chill through the group. They exchanged anxious glances, but no one dared to speak. The man gestured toward the stage again, and the curtains began to rise. The sight that greeted them was horrifying. The stage was set with props that looked disturbingly real: a rusted guillotine, a chair with leather straps, and a row of masks hanging ominously from hooks. The masks seemed to watch them, their empty eyes filled with a malevolent intelligence. As the man stepped aside, the first act began. The performers emerged from the shadows, their movements jerky and unnatural. They wore masks identical to the ones on the stage, their faces frozen in grotesque smiles. The play unfolded like a nightmare, blending reality with hallucination. The group quickly realized this was no ordinary performance. The actors seemed to be reenacting scenes from their own lives, scenes they had never shared with anyone. Emily clenched her fists, her breath coming in short gasps. Thomas felt his heart race as he recognized details from his past. Sarah tried to take notes, but her hands were shaking too much to write. Michael sat frozen, his eyes wide with terror. The theater was no longer a building, it was a living entity, feeding on their fear and secrets. They were trapped in a story they hadn't chosen, and the curtain had only just risen. The masked man reappeared on stage, his voice booming through the theater. "The show has begun," he said, his tone both mocking and reverent. "You must play your parts." There is no escape from the Orpheum Hall. The group exchanged desperate glances, but there was no way out. The doors had vanished, the walls closing in around them. They were no longer spectators. They were the stars of a macabre play, and the final act was yet to come. The spotlight intensified, casting their faces in stark relief. The masks on the stage seemed to twitch, as though eager to be worn. The performers began to chant, their voices merging into a single, dissonant note. Emily felt a strange compulsion to rise from her seat, to step onto the stage and claim a mask. The others felt it too, a pull they couldn't resist. The theater was in control now, and the performance would not end until it was satisfied. As they rose from their seats, the man in the mask bowed again, his gesture dripping with mockery. "The Orpheum Hall thanks you for your participation," he said. "The show must go on." The curtains began to close, but the group knew this was only the beginning. The theater had chosen them, and it would not let them go until the final curtain fell. The light dimmed once more, leaving them in darkness. The only sound was the faint creak of the stage floorboards, as though something lurked just beyond the edge of their vision. The Orpheum Hall had awakened, and it was hungry. The performance had only just begun, and the price of admission was far greater than any of them had imagined. The stage lights flickered ominously, casting long, distorted shadows across the theater. The air was thick with the scent of rot and something metallic, like blood. The group sat frozen in their seats, their eyes glued to the scene unfolding before them. The performers moved with unnatural precision, their masked faces tilting toward the audience as though they could see through the darkness. Emily felt a cold sweat drip down her back, her fingers digging into the armrests of her seat. The play had no discernible plot. It was a disjointed nightmare, a series of grotesque vignettes that seemed designed to unnerve. The first act began abruptly, with a performer dragging a lifeless body onto the stage. The corpse's face was obscured, but the clothing looked eerily familiar. Thomas stiffened, recognizing the suit as identical to the one he had worn to his father's funeral. The performer placed the body on a rusted table and began to carve into it with a bone-handled knife. The sound of metal scraping against flesh echoed through the theater, making Sarah gag. She clutched her notebook tightly, trying to distract herself by focusing on the details, but the sight was too horrifying to ignore. Michael's breath came in shallow gasps as he watched the scene unfold. The performer turned to the audience, holding up a beating heart in one hand. The organ pulsed with a sickening rhythm, its veins dangling like grotesque ribbons. The performer's mask twisted into a grimace as it devoured the heart, blood dripping down its chin. Michael felt a wave of nausea overwhelm him, but he couldn't look away. The theater seemed to pulse around him, its walls closing in as though it were alive and feeding on his fear. Emily's heart pounded as the performers turned their attention to her. One of them stepped forward, holding a mirror up to her face. The reflection wasn't her, it was a version of her with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. The reflection mouthed words she couldn't hear, its gaze piercing through her. She tried to look away, but the mirror followed her, forcing her to confront the image. The performer leaned in closer, the mask inches from her face, and whispered, "You're next." Thomas's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the performance. The scenes were too personal, too specific to be coincidental. The performer with the knife now held a photograph of his mother, one he hadn't seen in years. The image was burned at the edges, as though it had been rescued from a fire. The performer tore the photo into pieces, letting them fall to the stage like ash. Thomas felt a pang of grief and rage, but he couldn't move. The theater had him trapped, both physically and emotionally. Sarah's pen trembled in her hand as she tried to document the madness. The performers began chanting in a language she didn't recognize, their voices merging into a haunting melody. The words seemed to seep into her mind, repeating themselves like a mantra. She shook her head, trying to clear the noise, but it only grew louder. The theater was in her head now, twisting her thoughts and filling her with a deep, inexplicable dread. Michael's vision blurred as the performance continued. The stage transformed before his eyes, shifting from a simple set to a sprawling, nightmarish landscape. The walls dissolved, revealing a forest of gnarled trees and twisted vines. The performers moved through the forest, their masks now fused with their faces. They dragged coffins behind them, each one engraved with a name. Michael's stomach churned as he recognized his own name on one of the coffins. The air grew colder, the oppressive silence broken only by the sound of footsteps on the stage. The performers gathered in a circle, their heads tilting upward as though worshipping an unseen force. The ceiling above the stage cracked open, revealing a dark void that seemed to stretch endlessly. A faint light emerged from the void, illuminating a figure suspended in midair. It was the man in the mask, his form now larger and more menacing. "Welcome to the second act," the man's voice boomed, his words reverberating through the theater. "The price of admission must be paid." The performers turned toward the audience, their movements synchronized as they stepped off the stage and began to approach the seats. The group froze, their instincts screaming at them to run, but their bodies refused to obey. The performers moved with mechanical precision, their masks shifting into grotesque expressions of glee. Emily's pulse quickened as one of the performers stopped in front of her. It held out a mask identical to the ones on the stage, its surface slick with something dark and sticky. The mask seemed to pulse in the performer's hand, as though it were alive. Emily shook her head, but the performer leaned in closer, its breath cold against her skin. "Put it on," it whispered, its voice a chilling blend of malevolence and seduction. Thomas felt a hand grip his shoulder, forcing him to rise from his seat. Another performer stood behind him, holding a chainsaw that roared to life with a deafening growl. The performer dragged him toward the stage, the blade inches from his neck. He struggled, but the grip was unbreakable. The audience of shadows watched in silence, their presence a suffocating weight. Thomas's mind raced, searching for a way out, but the theater had him ensnared. Sarah's camera hung from her neck, her hands trembling too much to use it. A performer placed a wooden box in her lap, its surface carved with intricate symbols. She hesitated before opening it, her heart sinking as she saw the contents. Inside were photographs of her family, each one defaced with ink and ash. The performer pointed to the stage, where a reenactment of her childhood home was being burned. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized the theater knew everything about her. Michael's legs gave out as a performer dragged him onto the stage. The coffins surrounded him, their lids creaking open to reveal empty interiors. The performer with his name on the coffin pointed to it, its mask twisting into a grim smile. "Your turn," it said, its voice echoing through the void. Michael tried to scream, but no sound came out. The theater had claimed him, its grip tightening with every passing second. The man in the mask watched from above, his laughter filling the void. "The show must go on," he said, his voice dripping with malice. The performers began to chant again, their voices merging into a cacophony of fear and despair. The group was dragged onto the stage, their bodies moved like puppets by unseen strings. The masks hung from hooks, their empty eyes staring into their souls. Emily's hands shook as she reached for the mask in front of her. The performer's presence was overwhelming, its gaze burning into her. She tried to resist, but the mask seemed to call to her, its voice a whisper in her mind. "Put it on," it repeated, its tone both threatening and inviting. Emily's fingers brushed against the mask, and she felt a surge of something cold and alien. Thomas fought against the chainsaw's blade, his heart pounding in his chest. The performer forced him to the edge of the stage, where the void seemed to beckon. He looked out at the sea of shadows, their forms shifting and writhing like a nightmare made real. The performer leaned in, its mask inches from his face. "This is your role," it said, its voice devoid of emotion. Sarah clutched the box in her hands, tears streaming down her face. The performer gestured to the burning set of her childhood home, its flames flickering with an unnatural light. "This is your story," it said, its voice a chilling whisper. Sarah felt a surge of anger and grief, but it was quickly swallowed by the void. Michael stood before the coffin with his name on it, his body trembling with fear. The performer gestured for him to step inside, its mask twisting into a grotesque smile. "This is your fate," it said, its voice echoing through the void. Michael's legs moved on their own, stepping into the coffin as the lid began to close. The man in the mask laughed, his voice reverberating through the theater. "The performance is flawless," he said, his tone filled with twisted pride. The group was trapped, their fates sealed by the theater's insatiable hunger. The show had only just begun, and there was no escape. The lights dimmed once more, plunging the stage into darkness. The group was left in silence, their minds reeling from the horrors they had witnessed. The theater pulsed around them, its walls closing in as the second act drew to a close. The man in the mask watched from the void, his laughter echoing through the darkness. The performance was far from over, and the price of admission was yet to be paid. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating void that pressed against the group like a living entity. The stage lights flickered back on, revealing the performers standing in a perfect circle around them. Their masks were now fused to their faces, the grotesque smiles frozen in place. The air was thick with the scent of burning wax and decay, mingling with the metallic tang of blood. The group stood frozen, their bodies trembling as they tried to comprehend the nightmare they were trapped in. The man in the mask stepped forward, his presence commanding and unsettling. His mask was more elaborate than the others, adorned with intricate carvings that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light. His voice was deep and smooth, but there was an edge to it that made the group's skin crawl. "Congratulations," he said, spreading his arms grandly. "You have passed the first test. But the true performance has only just begun." Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she met the man's gaze. His eyes were invisible behind the mask, but she could feel them boring into her soul. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking despite her attempt to sound brave. The man tilted his head, his mask twisting into a grotesque grin. "I am Elias Blackthorne," he said, his voice dripping with theatrical flair, "the director of this humble establishment. And you, my dear, are my newest stars." Thomas clenched his fists, trying to steady his racing heart. "This is insane," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Elias turned to him, his movements unnaturally fluid. "Insanity is a matter of perspective," he said, his tone almost playful. "Here, in the Orpheum Hall, we create art that transcends the mundane. True art requires sacrifice, and you have been chosen to play a part in something extraordinary." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to make sense of Elias's words. She had researched theaters like this before, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of the Orpheum Hall. "What do you want from us?" she asked, her voice trembling. Elias's mask tilted, his grin widening. "Your fear," he said simply. "Your pain. Your very essence. These are the ingredients of true art, and I intend to create a masterpiece." Michael felt a surge of anger and fear as he stepped forward, his body trembling with adrenaline. "Let us go," he demanded, his voice shaking. Elias chuckled, a low, menacing sound that echoed through the theater. "Go?" he said, his tone mocking. "There is no escape from the Orpheum Hall. Once you enter, you are part of the performance. And the show must go on." The performers began to chant again, their voices merging into a haunting melody that seeped into the group's minds. The words were incomprehensible, but their meaning was clear. Survival would require unimaginable sacrifice. The theater seemed to pulse around them, its walls closing in as the chanting grew louder. The group exchanged desperate glances, but there was no way out. Elias gestured toward the stage, his movements grand and theatrical. "The next act awaits," he said, his voice brimming with excitement. "Each of you will play a role, and your performance will determine your fate. Fail, and you will become part of the theater's history. Succeed, and perhaps you will earn the privilege of being remembered." Emily's stomach churned as she realized the gravity of Elias's words. The roles weren't just parts in a play, they were tests designed to break them. She glanced at the others, their faces pale and drawn. Thomas's hands were clenched into fists, his jaw tight with determination. Sarah's eyes darted around the theater, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Michael's gaze was fixed on Elias, his expression a mix of fear and defiance. The lights flickered again, revealing a new set on the stage. The scene was a maze of mirrors, their surfaces cracked and stained with something dark. The performers stepped aside, gesturing for the group to enter. Elias's voice echoed through the theater as he announced the next act. "The mirror maze," he said, his tone menacing. "A test of self-reflection and survival. Enter and confront your darkest fears." The group hesitated, their instincts screaming at them to avoid the stage. But the performers closed in around them, their masks twisted into expressions of glee. The chanting grew louder, the words now filling the theater with a suffocating pressure. Emily was the first to step forward, her legs moving against her will. The others followed, their bodies trembling as they entered the maze. The mirrors reflected distorted versions of themselves, their faces twisted into expressions of fear and despair. The air was thick with the scent of blood and decay, making it difficult to breathe. The group moved through the maze, their reflections mocking them at every turn. Emily caught a glimpse of herself in one of the mirrors, her face frozen in a scream. The image turned to her, its eyes wide with terror, and whispered, "You're already dead." Thomas's heart raced as he navigated the maze, his body trembling with fear. The mirrors seemed to shift and move, creating new paths that led to dead ends. He caught a glimpse of his father in one of the reflections, his face pale and lifeless. The image reached out toward him, its fingers brushing against the glass. Thomas stumbled back, his breath coming in short gasps. Sarah's vision blurred as the mirrors began to close in around her. The reflections were no longer copies of herself, they were memories from her past, each one more painful than the last. She saw her childhood home burning, the flames consuming everything she had ever loved. The images seemed to leap out of the mirrors, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. Michael's legs gave out as he faced the final mirror in the maze. The reflection wasn't him, it was the man he had become, a hollow shell of his former self. The image stared back at him, its eyes empty and devoid of life. "This is you," it said, its voice cold and lifeless. Michael felt a wave of despair overwhelm him, but he couldn't look away. The maze ended abruptly, dumping the group back onto the stage. The performers surrounded them, their masks twisted into expressions of glee. Elias stepped forward, his grin wider than ever. "Excellently done," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "But the true test is yet to come. The final act awaits, and only the strongest will survive." The group exchanged desperate glances, their hope dwindling with each passing second. The theater's walls seemed to close in around them, its presence suffocating and inescapable. The performers began to chant again, their voices merging into a haunting melody that echoed through the void. Elias's laughter filled the theater as he gestured toward the final set. The stage transformed before their eyes, revealing a towering guillotine surrounded by flames. The performers dragged the group forward, their movements mechanical and precise. The chanting grew louder, the words now filling the theater with a suffocating pressure. As the group was forced onto the stage, they realized the horrifying truth: they were no longer participants. They were the final act, and the theater would not let them go until the performance was complete. Elias's laughter echoed through the void, his voice dripping with malice. "The show must go on," he said, his tone final and unyielding. The guillotine loomed on the stage, its blade gleaming in the flickering light. The flames around it roared hungrily, casting dancing shadows across the theater. The group was forced to their knees, the performers standing behind them with hands like iron clamps. Elias Blackthorne stood at the edge of the stage, his mask twisted into an expression of twisted delight. "This is the final act," he announced, his voice echoing through the void. "The ultimate test of your worth. Only one of you will survive." Emily's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she stared at the guillotine. The blade seemed to call to her, its edge promising a swift end to the nightmare. But Elias's voice filled her mind, drowning out her thoughts. "This is not the end," he said, his tone almost soothing. "This is the moment of transformation. Only through sacrifice can true art be achieved." Thomas fought against the performer's grip, his muscles straining with desperation. "This isn't art," he shouted, his voice raw with anger. "This is madness." Elias tilted his head, his mask shifting into a mocking grin. "Madness and art are two sides of the same coin," he replied. "You cannot have one without the other. Embrace it, and you may yet find freedom." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out. The performers were too strong, their grip unbreakable. The theater around her seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its walls closing in with every passing second. She glanced at the others, their faces pale and drawn. Together, they had survived this far, but the final act was designed to break them. Michael's vision blurred as he knelt before the guillotine. His body was numb, his mind overwhelmed by the horrors he had witnessed. The image from the mirror maze haunted him, the hollow shell of his former self staring back at him from the void. He felt a strange sense of resignation, as though his fate had already been decided. Elias stepped forward, his movements grand and theatrical. "The rules are simple," he said, his voice booming through the theater. "Each of you will choose another to sacrifice. The last one standing will be granted the privilege of leaving the Orpheum Hall." The group exchanged horrified glances, the weight of Elias's words sinking in. Emily's heart pounded as she realized the cruelty of the test. They had been pushed to their limits, forced to confront their darkest fears, and now they were being asked to turn on each other. She caught Thomas's eye, his expression a mix of fear and defiance. "We can't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling. Thomas's jaw tightened as he shook his head. "We have to stay together," he said, his voice low but firm. "If we refuse, maybe he'll let us go." Elias's laughter echoed through the theater, mocking their hope. "Refusal is not an option," he said, his tone cold and final. "The performance must go on." Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched her notebook, its pages filled with notes that now seemed meaningless. The performers tightened their grip, forcing the group to stand. The guillotine stood before them, its blade gleaming with an unnatural light. Elias gestured toward it, his grin widening. "Choose," he said, his voice dripping with malice. The silence that followed was deafening, the tension thick enough to cut. Emily's mind raced, searching for a way out. She couldn't bring herself to choose, to sacrifice someone else for her own survival. But the performer's grip was unyielding, their presence suffocating. Thomas's gaze shifted to Elias, his anger boiling over. "This is your game," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "But we're not playing." He lunged forward, breaking free of the performer's grip and charging at Elias. The theater seemed to hold its breath as Thomas reached the edge of the stage, his fists clenched. Elias didn't flinch. He raised a hand, and Thomas froze in place, his body locked in midair. "Brave but foolish," Elias said, his tone almost pitying. "You cannot fight the Orpheum Hall. It is alive, and it feeds on your resistance." He flicked his wrist, and Thomas was thrown back, his body slamming into the guillotine. The blade descended with a sickening thud, and the group let out a collective scream. Thomas's lifeless body crumpled to the floor, his blood pooling on the stage. The performers began to chant again, their voices merging into a haunting melody that filled the theater. Emily's vision blurred as tears streamed down her face. The horror of what she had witnessed threatened to overwhelm her. Elias stepped forward, his grin widening. "You see," he said, his voice almost gleeful. "The performance cannot be stopped. You must play your parts, or you will suffer the same fate." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out. The theater had claimed Thomas, and it would not stop until it had claimed them all. But she couldn't bring herself to choose, to sacrifice someone else for her own survival. She glanced at Michael, his expression hollow and resigned. Michael's body trembled as he rose to his feet, the performers releasing him. He stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Elias. "Take me," he said, his voice shaking but resolute. "Let them go." Elias's mask tilted, his grin widening. "Brave words," he said, his tone mocking. "But the performance is not yet complete." The performers forced Emily and Sarah to their knees, their grip unbreakable. Elias gestured toward the guillotine, his grin twisted with delight. "The final act is yours," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Choose, or suffer the consequences." The theater seemed to pulse around them, its walls closing in with every passing second. The chanting grew louder, the words now filling the void with a suffocating pressure. The group was trapped, their fate sealed by the Orpheum Hall's insatiable hunger. Elias's laughter echoed through the theater, his presence a constant reminder of their hopelessness. "The show must go on," he said, his tone final and unyielding. "And you, my dear stars, are the final act." The guillotine stood as a grim sentinel, its blade raised high and glinting in the flickering light of the flames. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she knelt before it, her hands trembling against the cold, blood-stained wood. Sarah was beside her, her face pale and streaked with tears. Michael stood a few feet away, his hollow eyes fixed on Elias. The theater seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with tension and despair. Elias raised his hands, his grin widening beneath the grotesque mask. "The time has come," he announced, his voice resonating with a chilling finality. "Make your choice." Emily's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic storm of fear and defiance. She couldn't bring herself to choose, to sacrifice someone else for her own survival. The image of Thomas's lifeless body flashed before her eyes, a stark reminder of the consequences of resistance. She glanced at Sarah, her friend's face a mirror of her own terror. "We can't do this," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the chanting of the performers. Sarah shook her head, her hands clutching her notebook like a lifeline. "There has to be another way," she said, her voice trembling. "We've survived this far. We can't let him win." But the performers tightened their grip, their masks twisted into expressions of gleeful anticipation. The weight of the theater pressed down on them, its presence suffocating and inescapable. Michael stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. His gaze was fixed on Elias, his expression unreadable. "You're a coward," he said, his voice low but steady, "hiding behind masks and tricks. If the theater is so powerful, why do you need us? Why can't you do this yourself?" Elias's grin faltered for a moment, his mask tilting to the side. "You dare question me?" he said, his tone icy. Emily's heart pounded as she watched Michael confront Elias. There was a defiance in his eyes that she hadn't seen before, a spark of hope in the darkness. She rose to her feet, the performer's grip loosening as she stepped forward. "He's right," she said, her voice gaining strength. "This isn't art. It's cruelty. And we're not going to let you make us part of it." Sarah stood beside her, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. "The Orpheum Hall feeds on fear," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "But it's not just our fear. It's yours, too. You're afraid of us, aren't you? That's why you're trying to break us." Elias's mask twisted into a grimace, his laughter fading into silence. The theater seemed to shudder, its walls trembling as though reacting to their words. Michael stepped closer to Elias, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're not in control," he said, his voice steady. "The theater is using you, just like it's using us. You're just another puppet in its twisted game." Elias's mask shifted, his grin returning, but it was weaker now, less certain. "Foolish words," he said, his tone mocking. "But they won't save you." The performers began to move, their jerky, mechanical steps closing in around the group. The chanting grew louder, the words now filling the theater with a suffocating pressure. Emily felt a surge of panic, but she forced herself to stand tall. "We're not afraid of you," she said, her voice ringing out. "And we're not playing your game anymore." Sarah opened her notebook, the pages filled with notes and sketches of the theater. "This place is a lie," she said, her voice gaining strength. "A twisted illusion created to feed on fear. But illusions can be shattered." She tore a page from the notebook, its edges curling as it caught fire from the nearby flames. The performers hesitated, their chanting faltering. Michael stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Elias. "You're not the director," he said, his voice cold. "You're just a part of the performance. And it's time for your final act." He reached out, his fingers brushing against Elias's mask. The theater seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with tension. Elias's mask cracked, a thin line spreading across its surface. His laughter turned to a snarl as he stepped back, his movements jerky and unnatural. "You cannot defy the Orpheum Hall," he said, his voice trembling. "It is eternal. It is alive." But his words lacked their earlier certainty. His presence diminished. Emily felt a surge of hope as she stepped forward, her hand reaching for the mask. "It's just an illusion," she said, her voice steady. "And we're done being afraid." She tore the mask from Elias's face, revealing a hollow void beneath. The theater shuddered, its walls cracking and crumbling as the illusion began to collapse. The performers' masks fell away, revealing empty, soulless husks beneath. The chanting turned to a dissonant wail as the theater began to collapse around them. The flames grew brighter, consuming the stage and the guillotine. The air was filled with the sound of shattering glass and crumbling stone, the Orpheum Hall's grip on reality slipping away. Sarah grabbed Emily's hand, her grip tight. "We did it," she said, her voice trembling with relief. The theater was dissolving around them, its once imposing structure reduced to ash and rubble. The void above the stage cracked open, revealing a faint light beyond. Michael stood at the edge of the crumbling stage, his gaze fixed on the light. "It's not over yet," he said, his voice steady. "We have to leave before it's too late." The group moved together, their steps hurried but determined. The theater was collapsing around them, its presence fading as the illusion shattered. Elias's voice echoed through the void, weak but still menacing. "You cannot escape," he said, his tone trembling. "The Orpheum Hall will always find you." But his words were silenced as the final wall crumbled, the light growing brighter with each passing second. The group stepped into the light, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and relief. The world around them shifted, the darkness of the theater replaced by the familiar streets of the town. The air was crisp and cold, the oppressive weight of the Orpheum Hall finally lifted. Emily collapsed to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "We're free," she whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah sat beside her, her notebook still clutched in her hands. Michael stood nearby, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The Orpheum Hall was gone, its illusion shattered. But the memory of it would linger, a haunting reminder of the darkness they had faced. The group sat together, their bodies trembling with exhaustion but their spirits unbroken. The nightmare was over, but the scars would remain, a testament to their strength and defiance. The cobblestone streets of the town were quiet, the early morning mist clinging to the ground like a shroud. Emily, Sarah, and Michael sat on the steps of an old, abandoned church, their bodies trembling with exhaustion but their spirits unbroken. The Orpheum Hall was gone, its illusion shattered, yet the memory of it lingered like a ghost in their minds. The air was crisp and cold, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of the theater. Emily wrapped her arms around herself, her breath visible in the dim light. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words and shared pain. Sarah opened her notebook, the pages now charred and torn. She flipped through them, her fingers trembling as she traced the sketches of the theater. "It's like it never existed," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it did. We lived through it." Michael nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's not something people will believe," he said, his tone grim. "And maybe that's for the best." Emily's mind raced as she tried to piece together what had happened. The Orpheum Hall had been a nightmare, a grotesque illusion designed to break them. Yet they had survived. They had shattered the illusion. But at what cost? The image of Thomas's lifeless body flashed before her eyes, a stark reminder of the price they had paid. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "We couldn't save him," she said, her voice trembling with guilt. Sarah reached out, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. "We did what we could," she said, her voice steady but filled with sorrow. "Thomas wouldn't want us to blame ourselves. He was brave until the end." Michael looked down, his jaw tight with anger. "We need to honor his memory," he said, his voice low. "But we also need to figure out what the Orpheum Hall really was. It couldn't have been just a theater." The group fell silent, the weight of Michael's words settling over them. The Orpheum Hall had been more than a building, it had been alive, feeding on their fear and pain. But where had it come from? And why had it chosen them? Emily's thoughts turned to Elias Blackthorne, the man behind the mask. He had claimed to be the director, but in the end, he had been just another pawn in the theater's twisted game. The sun began to rise, its pale light cutting through the mist. The town stirred to life around them, the sounds of distant footsteps and muffled voices breaking the silence. It was a stark reminder of the world they had returned to, a world that had no idea what they had endured. Emily stood, her legs shaky but determined. "We need to figure this out," she said, her voice firm. "We can't just pretend it didn't happen." Sarah nodded, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. "I'll do some research," she said, her voice steady. "There has to be something about the Orpheum Hall in the archives or old newspapers. It couldn't have just appeared out of nowhere." Michael stood beside them, his expression grim. "I'll help," he said, his voice low. "We'll start at the library. If there's anything to find, we'll find it." The group made their way through the quiet streets, the town slowly coming to life around them. The library was a small, unassuming building nestled between a bakery and a tailor's shop. Its windows were fogged with age, the faint scent of old paper and dust lingering in the air. Sarah pushed open the heavy wooden doors, the sound of a bell tinkling overhead. The librarian, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a stern expression, looked up from her desk. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of suspicion. Sarah stepped forward, her notebook in hand. "We're looking for information about an old theater," she said, her voice steady. "The Orpheum Hall." The librarian's expression shifted, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "The Orpheum Hall?" she repeated, her tone cautious. "I haven't heard that name in years." Emily's heart raced as she stepped forward. "You know it?" she asked, her voice trembling with hope. The librarian nodded slowly, her stern expression softening. "It was a theater that existed decades ago," she said, her voice low. "But it burned down in a terrible fire. No one survived." The group exchanged glances, the weight of the librarian's words settling over them. The librarian gestured for them to follow, leading them to a back room filled with old newspapers and dusty books. She pulled out a yellowed newspaper, its edges crumbled with age. The headline was stark, "Orpheum Hall Destroyed in Tragic Fire." Sarah took the newspaper, her hands trembling as she read the article. "It says the fire started on stage during a performance," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The audience was trapped, and no one escaped." Michael's fists clenched as he read over Sarah's shoulder. "So it was real," he said, his voice grim. "But what does that mean for us? How did we end up there?" The librarian shook her head, her expression somber. "Some say the Orpheum Hall was cursed," she said, her voice low. "That it was built on the grounds of an old asylum, and the spirits of the dead haunted it. But that's just small-town gossip." Emily's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the librarian's words. The Orpheum Hall had been real once, but it had been destroyed. Yet, they had been inside it, trapped in its twisted illusion. Was it possible that the theater had been resurrected by the spirits of the dead? The library was silent except for the faint rustling of paper and the steady ticking of a clock. Emily, Sarah, and Michael sat huddled around an old wooden table, surrounded by stacks of yellowed newspapers and dusty books. The librarian's words echoed in their minds. The Orpheum Hall was cursed. The idea seemed absurd, yet it was the only explanation that made sense. They had been inside a theater that no longer existed, caught in a nightmare that felt all too real. Emily's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages of an old journal, her eyes scanning the faded handwriting. "There's something here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It mentions the asylum." Sarah leaned in, her eyes narrowing as she read the passage. "It says the asylum was shut down in the early 1900s, she said, her voice steady. "Patients were mistreated, and there were rumors of experiments. Then, in the 1920s, the Orpheum Hall was built on the same site." Michael's jaw tightened as he listened, his fists clenched on the table. "So the theater was built on haunted ground," he said, his tone grim. "That explains why it felt so alive." The group fell silent, the weight of the revelation settling over them. The Orpheum Hall hadn't just been a theater, it had been a vessel for the spirits of the dead, a place where the line between reality and illusion blurred. Emily's thoughts turned to Elias Blackthorne, the man behind the mask. Had he been one of the spirits, or just another victim caught in the theater's web? The journal offered no answers, its pages filled with cryptic notes and fragmented memories. Sarah pulled out her notebook, scribbling down the key details. "We need to find out more about the asylum," she said, her voice determined. "If the Orpheum Hall was tied to it, maybe we can find a way to break the curse." Michael nodded, his gaze fixed on the old journal. "But how?" he asked, his tone tinged with frustration. "It's been over a century since the asylum shut down. There's no one left to tell us what happened." Emily's mind raced as she tried to piece together the puzzle. The Orpheum Hall had been a nightmare, but it had also been a warning. The spirits of the asylum had used the theater to communicate, to show them the horrors of the past. But why them? Why now? She glanced at the old journal, her eyes lingering on a faded sketch of the asylum. "We need to visit the site," she said, her voice firm. "If we can find the remains of the asylum, maybe we can uncover the truth." The group exchanged glances, the weight of Emily's words settling over them. Visiting the site of the asylum was a dangerous idea, but it was the only lead they had. Sarah nodded, her expression resolute. "We'll go," she said, her voice steady. "But we need to be careful. If the spirits are still there, we could be walking into another trap." Michael stood, his fists clenched. "We've faced worse," he said, his tone grim. "And we're not going to let them win." The sun was beginning to set as the group made their way through the town, the streets quiet and empty. The site of the asylum was on the outskirts, a forgotten piece of land overgrown with weeds and shrouded in darkness. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, the silence broken only by the distant rustling of leaves. Emily's heart pounded as they approached the site, her body tensed for whatever lay ahead. The remains of the asylum were barely visible, their crumbling walls barely standing against the weight of time. The building was a shadow of its former self, its windows shattered and its roof collapsed. Yet, it exuded an eerie presence, its walls seeming to pulse with a faint, unnatural energy. The group paused at the edge of the ruins, the weight of the past pressing down on them. Sarah's notebook trembled in her hands as she stared at the building, her expression a mix of fear and determination. Michael stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the ruins. "This is it," he said, his voice low. "The source of the curse." Emily nodded, her hands clenched into fists. "We need to go inside," she said, her voice steady. "But we stay together. No matter what happens, we don't let the spirits separate us." The group moved forward, their footsteps echoing through the ruins as they entered the remains of the asylum. The inside of the building was a labyrinth of crumbling walls and broken furniture, its floors littered with debris and shattered glass. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the walls seeming to close in around them. Emily's heart raced as she led the way, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The air grew colder with each step, their breath visible in the dim light. There was a stillness to the ruins, a silence that felt unnatural and oppressive. Sarah's eyes widened as she spotted something on the floor, a pile of old photographs, their edges frayed and stained with something dark. She knelt down, her hands trembling as she picked them up. They were images of patients, their faces hollow and their eyes filled with despair. The photographs were a stark reminder of the horrors that had taken place within these walls. Sarah's notebook fell from her hands as she stared at the images, her mind overwhelmed by the weight of the past. Michael's fists clenched as he looked at the photographs, his expression filled with anger. "They were tortured," he said, his voice low and trembling. "Experimented on. No wonder the spirits are angry." Emily nodded, her heart heavy with sorrow. The asylum had been a place of unspeakable cruelty, its victims trapped even in death. The Orpheum Hall was just another chapter in their suffering, a twisted manifestation of their pain. The group moved deeper into the ruins, the air growing colder with each step. The walls seemed to close in around them, the shadows shifting and twisting as though alive. Emily's body tensed as she felt a sudden presence behind her, her breath catching in her throat. She turned, but there was nothing there, only the faint sound of distant whispers. The spirits were here, their presence growing stronger with each passing moment. Sarah's eyes widened as she spotted something on the wall, a series of symbols carved into the stone, their edges worn with age. She reached out, her fingers tracing the grooves. "It's a ritual," she said, her voice trembling. "Something to bind the spirits to the asylum. But it's incomplete." Michael stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the symbols. "If we can complete it," he said, his tone grim, "maybe we can free them." The group exchanged glances, the weight of Michael's words settling over them. Completing the ritual was dangerous. It could unleash the spirits or trap them forever. But it was the only way to end the curse. Emily nodded, her expression resolute. "We have to try," she said, her voice steady. "We owe it to them." The air grew colder as the group began to carve the missing symbols into the wall, their hands trembling with fear and determination. The whispers grew louder, the spirit's presence overwhelming. The ruins seemed to pulse with energy, the air thick with the scent of decay and burning wood. The final symbol was carved, and the group stepped back, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. The silence was deafening, the air still and heavy. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the symbols began to glow, their light piercing through the darkness. The walls of the asylum seemed to dissolve, the ruins fading into nothingness. The spirits' whispers grew faint, their presence fading as they were finally freed. The group stood together, their bodies trembling with relief as the curse was broken. But as the ruins disappeared, Emily felt a sudden chill, a faint presence that lingered in the air. The Orpheum Hall was gone, its illusion shattered, but something remained. The spirits had been freed, but their pain would never be forgotten. The group stood in the empty field, the weight of the past still pressing down on them. The nightmare was over, but the scars would remain, a testament to the horrors they had faced. The sun began to rise, its pale light cutting through the mist. The group exchanged glances, their bodies trembling with exhaustion but their spirits unbroken. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, but the fight had come at a cost. The Orpheum Hall was gone, but its memory would linger, a haunting reminder of the unseen threads that bind the past to the present. The morning light filtered through the trees as Emily, Sarah, and Michael stood in the empty field where the asylum had once stood. The ruins were gone, dissolved into nothingness as the curse was broken. Yet, the air still felt heavy, the faint scent of decay lingering like a ghost. Emily wrapped her arms around herself, her body trembling with exhaustion. The nightmare was over, but something still felt wrong. She glanced at the others, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes reflecting the same unease. The sun was rising, but its light offered little comfort. Sarah clutched her notebook, its pages filled with notes and sketches of the asylum and the Orpheum Hall. Her hands trembled as she flipped through them, her mind racing with unanswered questions. "We did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The curse is broken. The spirits are free." But her words felt hollow, the weight of the past still pressing down on her. Michael nodded, his jaw tight with tension. "It's over," he said, his tone grim. "But it doesn't feel like it." The group fell silent, the quiet of the field amplifying their unease. The air seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the remnants of the curse still lingering in the shadows. Emily's thoughts turned to Thomas, his lifeless body a stark reminder of the cost of their survival. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "We lost him," she said, her voice trembling with guilt. "We couldn't save him." Sarah reached out, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. "He wouldn't want us to blame ourselves," she said, her voice steady but filled with sorrow. Michael stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We need to honor his memory," he said, his voice low. "But we also need to figure out what's still going on. The curse is broken, but it feels like there's more to this." The group exchanged glances, the weight of Michael's words settling over them. The Orpheum Hall was gone, the asylum dissolved, but the shadows of the past still lingered. The sound of footsteps broke the silence, the crunch of gravel underfoot echoing through the field. The group turned, their bodies tensed for whatever lay ahead. A figure emerged from the mist, their silhouette tall and imposing. It was a man, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide-brimmed hat. His steps were slow and deliberate, his presence unnerving. Emily's heart raced as the man approached, her body instinctively stepping back. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man stopped a few feet away, his hands tucked into the pockets of his long coat. His face was shadowed, but his voice was calm and measured. "I've been watching you," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. "You've done well. The curse is broken, but the fight isn't over." Sarah's eyes narrowed as she stepped forward, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with suspicion. The man tilted his head, his face still hidden in shadow. "The Orpheum Hall was just the beginning," he said, his tone grim. "There are other places like it, other curses that need to be broken. The spirits you freed were just a small part of something much larger." Michael's fists clenched as he stepped forward, his expression filled with anger. "We're done," he said, his voice low and trembling. "We've been through enough. We're not fighting your battles." The man's voice remained calm, his presence unnerving. "This isn't my fight," he said, his tone even. "It's yours. The Orpheum Hall chose you for a reason. You have the strength to face what's coming." Emily's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the man's words. The Orpheum Hall had been a nightmare, but it had also been a test. And now, there were other places like it, other curses waiting to be broken. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she stepped forward, her notebook trembling in her hands. "Why us?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with anger. "What makes you think we can handle this?" The man's face remained hidden, but his tone was resolute. "You've already proven yourselves," he said. "You faced the Orpheum Hall and survived. Now, you need to face what's next." The group fell silent, the weight of the man's words settling over them. The idea of facing another curse was terrifying, but it was also inevitable. The Orpheum Hall had chosen them, and now there was no escaping the fight. Emily's hands trembled as she clenched them into fists, her body filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "What's coming?" she asked, her voice trembling but resolute. The man's silence was deafening, the air thick with tension. He reached into his coat, pulling out a small, weathered journal. He handed it to Emily, his movements slow and deliberate. "This will guide you," he said, his tone final. "But be warned, the road ahead is dangerous, and not everyone will survive." Emily took the journal, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. The weight of it in her hands felt like a burden, but also a lifeline. The man turned, his silhouette fading into the mist as he walked away. The group stood in silence, the journal clutched tightly in Emily's hands. The sun was rising, its pale light offering little comfort. The man's words lingered in the air, a chilling reminder of the fight that lay ahead. The Orpheum Hall was gone, but the shadows of the past still lingered, waiting to be confronted. Sarah's eyes were wide with fear as she looked at Emily. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Emily's gaze was fixed on the journal, her expression a mix of fear and determination. "We prepare," she said, her voice steady. "If there are other curses out there, we need to be ready. We can't let them win." Michael's fists were clenched, his expression filled with anger and resolve. "We've been through hell," he said, his voice low and trembling. "But we're still here. Whatever's coming, we'll face it together." The group exchanged glances, their bodies trembling with exhaustion but their spirits unbroken. The sun continued to rise, its light cutting through the mist. The shadows of the past still lingered, but they were no longer as overwhelming. The group stood together, the journal clutched tightly in Emily's hands. The fight was far from over, but they were ready. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, and they would do it again. The man's words echoed in their minds, a chilling reminder of the fight that lay ahead. But they were stronger now, their bond unbreakable. The Orpheum Hall had been a nightmare, but it had also been a test. And now they were prepared for what was coming. The shadows of the past still lingered, but the group was ready to face them. The journal felt heavy in Emily's hands, its weathered pages brittle and yellowed with age. The group sat on the steps of the old church, the morning sun casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets. Sarah leaned in, her eyes fixed on the journal as Emily carefully flipped through its pages. The handwriting was faded but legible, the ink smudged in places. The entries were disjointed, filled with cryptic notes and fragmented memories. Michael sat beside them, his jaw tight with tension as he watched the pages turn. The air was thick with unease, the weight of the journal's secrets pressing down on them. Sarah pointed to a page filled with strange symbols, her fingers trembling as she traced the lines. "These look like the ones we saw in the asylum," she said, her voice low. "But there's more here. It's like a map or a guide." Emily's eyes scanned the page, her mind racing as she tried to decipher the symbols. The journal was more than just a record. It was a key to something much larger. The man who had given it to them had spoken of other curses, places like the Orpheum Hall that needed to be confronted. The journal was their way forward, but its secrets were shrouded in mystery. Michael leaned in, his gaze fixed on the symbols. "We need to figure out what this means," he said, his voice steady but grim. "If there are other cursed places out there, we need to know where they are and how to break them." The group fell silent, the weight of Michael's words settling over them. The Orpheum Hall had been a nightmare, but the idea of facing other curses was overwhelming. Yet, the journal offered Hope a way to confront the darkness and finally put an end to it. Emily turned the page, her breath catching in her throat. The next entry was a detailed account of another cursed place, a forgotten prison on the edge of the town, buried deep in the woods. The description was chilling, its walls filled with the screams of the damned. The journal spoke of rituals and sacrifices, of a curse that had festered for decades. Emily's hands trembled as she read the words, her mind filled with images of what lay ahead. "This is the next place," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man wasn't lying. There are other curses out there. Sarah's eyes widened as she read the entry, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. "This prison, it's real?" she asked, her voice trembling. Michael nodded, his expression grim. "I've heard stories about it," he said, his voice low. "They say it was shut down years ago, but no one knows why. People who go near it never come back." The group fell silent, the weight of the journal's revelation settling over them. The prison was another nightmare waiting to be confronted, its curse as dark and twisted as the Orpheum halls. Emily's mind raced as she flipped through the journal, her eyes scanning the entries for more information. The prison was just one of several cursed places mentioned, each one more terrifying than the last. There was a church that burned to the ground, its congregation trapped inside. There was an old mansion on the hill, its halls filled with the whispers of the dead. The journal was a map of horrors, each curse tied to the next in a web of darkness. Emily's hands trembled as she turned the pages, her heart heavy with fear and determination. Sarah's voice broke the silence, her tone steady but filled with resolve. "We need to go to the prison," she said, her gaze fixed on the journal. "If it's cursed, we need to break it. We can't let these places keep hurting people." Michael nodded, his fists clenched. "But we need to be careful," he said, his voice low. "The Orpheum Hall nearly killed us. We can't afford to make any mistakes." The group fell silent, the weight of their decision pressing down on them. The prison was a dangerous place, its curse as dark and twisted as the Orpheum halls. But the journal offered a way to break it, a series of rituals and symbols that could free the spirits trapped within. Emily's hands trembled as she traced the symbols, her mind racing as she tried to commit them to memory. The fight was far from over, but they were prepared. The sun was rising higher in the sky, its light casting long shadows across the steps of the church. The group gathered their things, their bodies trembling with exhaustion but their spirits unbroken. The prison was their next destination, its curse waiting to be confronted. Emily clutched the journal tightly, its weight in her hands a reminder of the fight that lay ahead. The road was dangerous, but they were ready. The streets were quiet as the group made their way to the edge of the town, the journal tucked safely in Emily's bag. The air was thick with tension, the weight of their mission pressing down on them. The prison was buried deep in the woods, its presence looming like a shadow. Emily's heart raced as they approached the edge of the forest, her body tensed for whatever lay ahead. The Orpheum Hall had been a nightmare, but the prison was another test, another step toward breaking the curses that bound the past. The woods were dark and silent, the trees towering above them like sentinels. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, the ground covered in a layer of fallen leaves. The group moved cautiously, their footsteps soft against the forest floor. The prison was somewhere in the heart of the woods, its cursed walls hidden from view. Emily's hands trembled as she clutched the journal, her mind filled with images of what lay ahead. Sarah's voice broke the silence, her tone steady but filled with unease. "We're close," she said, her gaze fixed on the trees ahead. "I can feel it." Michael nodded, his fists clenched at his sides. "Stay sharp," he said, his voice low. "We don't know what's out here." The group moved forward, their bodies tense with anticipation. The prison was a dangerous place, its curse as dark and twisted as the Orpheum halls. But they were prepared, ready to face the darkness and finally put an end to it. The prison emerged from the shadows, its crumbling walls barely standing against the weight of time. The building was a relic of the past, its architecture old and decrepit. The air was thick with an unnatural energy, the scent of decay and burning wood lingering in the air. The group paused at the edge of the clearing, their bodies trembling with fear and determination. The prison's curse was alive, its presence overwhelming. Emily's eyes narrowed as she stepped forward, the journal clutched tightly in her hands. "This is it," she said, her voice steady. "The next curse." Sarah and Michael followed, their bodies tense with anticipation. The prison was another nightmare waiting to be confronted, its curse as dark and twisted as the Orpheum halls. But they were ready, prepared to face the darkness and finally break the curse. The air grew colder as the group approached the prison's entrance, their footsteps echoing against the stone floor. The building was a labyrinth of crumbling walls and broken furniture, its floors littered with debris and shattered glass. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the walls pulsing with an unnatural energy. Emily's heart raced as she led the way, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Sarah's eyes widened as she spotted something on the floor, a pile of old letters, their edges frayed and stained with something dark. She knelt down, her hands trembling as she picked them up. They were written by prisoners, their words filled with despair and pain. The letters were a stark reminder of the horrors that had taken place within these walls. Sarah's notebook fell from her hands as she stared at the letters, her mind overwhelmed by the weight of the past. Michael's fists clenched as he looked at the letters, his expression filled with anger. "They were tortured," he said, his voice low and trembling. "No wonder the spirits are angry." Emily nodded, her heart heavy with sorrow. The prison had been a place of unspeakable cruelty, its victims trapped even in death. Its curse was just another chapter in their suffering, a twisted manifestation of their pain. The group moved deeper into the prison, the air growing colder with each step. The walls seemed to close in around them, the shadows shifting and twisting as though alive. Emily's body tensed as she felt a sudden presence behind her, her breath catching in her throat. She turned, but there was nothing there, only the faint sound of distant whispers. The spirits were here, their presence growing stronger with each passing moment. Sarah's eyes widened as she spotted something on the wall, a series of symbols carved into the stone, their edges worn with age. She reached out, her fingers tracing the grooves. "It's a ritual," she said, her voice trembling. "Something to bind the spirits to the prison. But it's incomplete." Michael stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the symbols. "If we can complete it," he said, his tone grim, "maybe we can free them." The group exchanged glances, the weight of Michael's words settling over them. Completing the ritual was dangerous. It could unleash the spirits or trap them forever. But it was the only way to end the curse. Emily nodded, her expression resolute. "We have to try," she said, her voice steady. "We owe it to them." The air grew colder as the group began to carve the missing symbols into the wall, their hands trembling with fear and determination. The whispers grew louder, the spirit's presence overwhelming. The prison seemed to pulse with energy, the air thick with the scent of decay and burning wood. The final symbol was carved, and the group stepped back, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. The silence was deafening, the air still and heavy. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the symbols began to glow, their light piercing through the darkness. The walls of the prison seemed to dissolve, the ruins fading into nothingness. The spirits' whispers grew faint, their presence fading as they were finally freed. The group stood together, their bodies trembling with relief as the curse was broken. But as the prison disappeared, Emily felt a sudden chill, a faint presence that lingered in the air. The curse was gone, its walls shattered, but something remained. The spirits had been freed, but their pain would never be forgotten. The group stood in the empty clearing, the weight of the past still pressing down on them. The nightmare was over, but the scars would remain, a testament to the horrors they had faced. The sun began to rise, its pale light cutting through the mist. The group exchanged glances, their bodies trembling with exhaustion but their spirits unbroken. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, but the fight had come at a cost. The prison was gone, but its memory would linger, a haunting reminder of the unseen threads that bind the past to the present. The clearing where the prison had stood was silent, the air heavy with the remnants of the curse. Emily, Sarah, and Michael stood together, their bodies trembling with exhaustion but their spirits unbroken. The prison was gone, dissolved into nothingness as the curse was broken. Yet, the faint presence of the spirits lingered, their whispers echoing in the back of their minds. The sun was rising, its pale light offering little comfort. The fight was far from over, and the group knew it. Emily clutched the journal tightly, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. The symbols they had carved into the prison's walls had worked, breaking the curse and freeing the spirits. But the journal held more secrets, more cursed places waiting to be confronted. Emily's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the entries for the next location. The weight of the journal's secrets pressed down on her, its knowledge both a blessing and a burden. Sarah's eyes were wide with fear as she looked at Emily. "What's next?" she asked, her voice trembling. Emily's gaze was fixed on the journal, her expression a mix of fear and determination. "There's a church," she said, her voice steady. "It burned down years ago, trapping the congregation inside. It's another cursed place." Michael's fists clenched as he listened, his expression grim. "Another nightmare," he said, his voice low. "But we'll face it. Together." The group fell silent, the weight of their decision pressing down on them. The church was another cursed place, its walls filled with the screams of the damned. The journal mentioned rituals and symbols, a way to break the curse and free the spirits. But the fight would be dangerous, the curse as dark and twisted as the Orpheum Hall and the prison. Emily's hands trembled as she traced the symbols in the journal, her mind racing as she tried to commit them to memory. The sun was rising higher in the sky, its light casting long shadows across the clearing. The group gathered their things, their bodies trembling with exhaustion but their spirits unbroken. The church was their next destination, its curse waiting to be confronted. Emily clutched the journal tightly, its weight in her hands a reminder of the fight that lay ahead. The road was dangerous, but they were ready. The woods were quiet as the group made their way back to the town, the journal tucked safely in Emily's bag. The air was thick with tension, the weight of their mission pressing down on them. The church was on the outskirts of the town, its cursed walls hidden from view. Emily's heart raced as they approached the edge of the forest, her body tensed for whatever lay ahead. The Orpheum Hall had been a nightmare, the prison another test, but the church was a different kind of horror. The streets were quiet as the group made their way to the church, the journal clutched tightly in Emily's hands. The building loomed in the distance, its charred walls a stark reminder of the tragedy that had taken place within. The air was thick with the scent of ash and burning wood, the ground littered with debris and shattered glass. The group paused at the edge of the clearing, their bodies trembling with fear and determination. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she looked at the church, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. "This is it," she said, her voice steady. "The next curse." Michael nodded, his fists clenched at his sides. "Stay sharp," he said, his voice low. "We don't know what's in there." The group moved forward, their bodies tense with anticipation. The church was a dangerous place, its curse as dark and twisted as the Orpheum Hall and the prison. Emily's heart raced as they approached the church's entrance, her body tensed for whatever lay ahead. The building was a relic of the past, its walls charred and crumbling. The air was thick with an unnatural energy, the scent of ash and burning wood lingering in the air. The group paused at the edge of the clearing, their bodies trembling with fear and determination. The church's doors creaked open, the sound echoing through the empty streets. The group exchanged glances, their bodies tense with anticipation. The church was another nightmare waiting to be confronted, its curse as dark and twisted as the Orpheum Hall and the prison. But they were ready, prepared to face the darkness and finally break the curse. Emily stepped forward, the journal clutched tightly in her hands. "This is it," she said, her voice steady. "Let's end this." Sarah and Michael followed, their bodies tense with anticipation. The air grew colder as they stepped inside the church, their footsteps echoing against the stone floor. The building was a labyrinth of charred walls and broken furniture, its floors littered with debris and shattered glass. Sarah's eyes widened as she spotted something on the floor, a pile of old photographs, their edges frayed and stained with something dark. She knelt down, her hands trembling as she picked them up. They were images of the congregation, their faces hollow and their eyes filled with despair. The photographs were a stark reminder of the horrors that had taken place within these walls. Sarah's notebook fell from her hands as she stared at the images, her mind overwhelmed by the weight of the past. Michael's fists clenched as he looked at the photographs, his expression filled with anger. "They were trapped," he said, his voice low and trembling. "Burned alive. No wonder the spirits are angry." Emily nodded, her heart heavy with sorrow. The church had been a place of unspeakable cruelty, its victims trapped even in death. Its curse was just another chapter in their suffering, a twisted manifestation of their pain. The group moved deeper into the church, the air growing colder with each step. The walls seemed to close in around them, the shadows shifting and twisting as though alive. Emily's body tensed as she felt a sudden presence behind her, her breath catching in her throat. She turned, but there was nothing there, only the faint sound of distant whispers. The spirits were here, their presence growing stronger with each passing moment. Sarah's eyes widened as she spotted something on the wall, a series of symbols carved into the stone, their edges worn with age. She reached out, her fingers tracing the grooves. "It's a ritual," she said, her voice trembling. "Something to bind the spirits to the church. But it's incomplete." Michael stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the symbols. "If we can complete it," he said, his tone grim, "maybe we can free them." The group exchanged glances, the weight of Michael's words settling over them. Completing the ritual was dangerous. It could unleash the spirits or trap them forever. But it was the only way to end the curse. Emily nodded, her expression resolute. "We have to try," she said, her voice steady. "We owe it to them." The air grew colder as the group began to carve the missing symbols into the wall, their hands trembling with fear and determination. The whispers grew louder, the spirit's presence overwhelming. The church seemed to pulse with energy, the air thick with the scent of ash and burning wood. The final symbol was carved, and the group stepped back, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. The silence was deafening, the air still and heavy. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the symbols began to glow, their light piercing through the darkness. The walls of the church seemed to dissolve, the ruins fading into nothingness. The spirits' whispers grew faint, their presence fading as they were finally freed. The group stood together, their bodies trembling with relief as the curse was broken. But as the church disappeared, Emily felt a sudden chill, a faint presence that lingered in the air. The curse was gone, its walls shattered, but something remained. The spirits had been freed, but their pain would never be forgotten. The group stood in the empty clearing, the weight of the past still pressing down on them. The nightmare was over, but the scars would remain, a testament to the horrors they had faced. The sun began to rise, its pale light cutting through the mist. The group exchanged glances, their bodies trembling with exhaustion but their spirits unbroken. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, but the fight had come at a cost. The church was gone, but its memory would linger, a haunting reminder of the unseen threads that bind the past to the present.